Hello and welcome to My Baseball History. I'm your host, Dan Wallach. My Baseball History is a long-form interview podcast where each episode I'll talk to someone new who has some sort of association to the game of baseball. No matter who I talk to, we'll talk about how they fell in love with baseball, how their career started, and how they got to be where they are today. On today's episode, I spoke with the former owner of Mitchell & Ness, Peter Capolino. Peter's dad owned the company before him, so Peter grew up helping him supply the Philadelphia Athletics, the Philadelphia Phillies, and most importantly to Peter, the Philadelphia Eagles, with equipment and uniforms since Mitchell & Ness was the official on-field outfitter of each team. Peter went to Yeadon High School in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, then went to Susquehanna University where he graduated in 1967. Little did he know that less than 20 years later, Peter would create something that would change the way people all over the world would dress. Nowadays, basically every team in North American professional sports wears retro uniforms and sells them in their team stores. They're so popular that teams like the Tampa Bay Rays, who haven't been around long enough to have real, authentically historic uniforms, have imagined what their old threads may have looked like, and they sell those in the team store. Peter Capolino essentially invented the idea of a throwback jersey in 1983 when a man walked into Mitchell & Ness to have two game-worn baseball jerseys repaired. In attempting to do so, Peter discovered thousands of yards of discarded wool flannel, which inspired him to begin recreating vintage jerseys to sell in his store. Peter's list of clients over the years is the who's who of sports and entertainment, and his creations have been worn in music videos, on concert stages, on red carpets, and on magazine covers by everyone from Will Smith and Mick Jagger to Allen Iverson and Kobe Bryant, from Jamie Lee Curtis and Larry King to Sylvester Stallone and Fat Joe. Peter is often credited with being the founder of Mitchell & Ness, but as we'll learn in the interview, that's not quite accurate. Mitchell & Ness Sporting Goods was formed in 1904 by Frank P. Mitchell and Charles M. Ness. The two former athletes and sports enthusiasts opened a store on Arch Street in Philadelphia, which specialized in handcrafted tennis rackets, golf clubs, and other equipment. While Peter Capolino would become the owner of Mitchell & Ness in the late 1970s, it had been around for more than 70 years by the time he took over. What Peter did found was the Mitchell & Ness Nostalgia Co. We talk extensively about both companies in this interview and what the distinction is between the two. If you've listened to previous episodes of the show or follow me on social media, you probably know I have a pretty elaborate Michael Jordan jersey collection. Everything from his high school jerseys to college jerseys, every variation of his NBA jerseys from 23s to 45s, and yes, even his number 12 that he wore one night in Orlando, All-Star Game jerseys, Olympic jerseys, and the Space Jam jersey. And since this podcast is called My Baseball History, I feel the need to disclose that I also have multiple baseball jerseys ranging from home, away, and batting practice Birmingham Barons jerseys to Scottsdale Scorpions jerseys and even White Sox jerseys he wore in batting practices, spring training games, or exhibition events. An extremely large chunk of my collection is the direct result of Peter Capolino's brilliance at Mitchell & Ness. Peter Capolino was inducted into the National Sporting Goods Association Hall of Fame in 2020. As you may be aware, for as famous as he is and as important to the culture as he is, Peter doesn't do podcast interviews very often. So it was an incredible thrill to meet him and a huge honor to be able to sit down with him and ask him questions for a couple hours that I've wanted to ask him for a couple decades. In this episode, we cover lots of ground. Peter tells us how his hobby of creating scrapbooks as a child helped him build a mental archive that would aid him in his business for decades. We find out how Mitchell & Ness, the brand which sold for $215 million in February of 2022, almost went bankrupt under Peter's watch, and what he did to turn things around. We learn how an article in Sports Illustrated in 1987 led to a lawsuit for Major League Baseball which changed the course of history. And we hear how musicians like Jay-Z, Outkast, Run DMC, and Biz Markie took this small local sporting goods store from Philadelphia and placed it squarely on the global map. With all of that information and much, much more coming at you, it may be helpful to follow along with the episode's liner notes on our podcast website. You'll still be able to enjoy the interview without the extra help, but sometimes when I'm listening to things like this, I like to really go in depth, so I've provided some photos and links to give you a better understanding of the things Peter and I are discussing. Those liner notes can be found on the My Baseball History website, which is online at www.shoelesspodcast.com. If you want to follow along, head to the website where you'll see the Peter Capolino episode listed first on the main page under Latest Episodes. Click on that and you'll be ready to follow along. There's an embedded media player right on the page, so you don't need to have multiple windows open while you listen or fumble around with multiple devices. If you want to catch up on any of our previous episodes, you can click on the tabs at the top of the website to go back through past episodes from any of the 3 seasons to date and see a full list of everything we have to offer so far. Everything in the liner notes goes in chronological order of how we talked about them in the interview, so you should easily be able to keep your place as you listen. After the interview, we'll do a recap of what you just heard, adding some extra insight and hopefully answering any questions that may have come up as you listened, so stick around until the end of the episode for that. But now, here's my interview with the former owner of Mitchell & Ness, sports fashion pioneer, Peter Capolino. I normally start out these interviews by asking people to tell me a little bit about where they grew up, and we'll get to that in a second, but I think we need to start with your dad. Tell us about where your dad was born and how he got to Philadelphia.
All right. My dad was born in Formia, Italy, and Formia is halfway between Rome and Naples on the Mediterranean side. He was born in 1904. His mother and father and sister needed to escape Formia in 1913 because there was a cholera epidemic working its way up from Naples, which had actually started in the south of Spain. In 1917, my father, his mother and father came to America on a ship, and they left the daughter in an orphanage. They didn't have enough money, and they could only take my dad. My dad's mother died on the boat on the way over to America.
Wow.
My dad's father remarried into an Italian family in South Philadelphia. My dad was not exactly happy with that Italian family after a period of time. And in 1919, he was on the streets of Philadelphia, and he walked by Mitchell & Ness, and he said to them, "I would like to work here if you let me sleep here. That's all you have to do." And Mr. Mitchell and Mr. Ness in 1919 took my father in.
And your dad's name was?
Sisto Capolino. Yeah, there's even the Ponte Sisto in Rome. There's a bridge in Rome. And a pope, obviously, Pope Sisto.
And did he speak English at that time?
I don't know. Mr. Mitchell and Mr. Ness took him in 1919. He stayed there his whole life. He bought the company in 1952, and he died in 1978. He must have spoken English pretty well because I was born in 1945, and my entire life, my father never spoke Italian to us. Only on Sundays, he would take me out to restaurants in South Philadelphia, and he would speak Italian to the waiters. Other than that, I never heard him speak Italian.
Interesting. And I think for companies who have been around for a long time, people forget that they were named after real people. You know, like Macy's was named for Roland Hussey Macy. Sears used to be Sears and Roebuck. It was named after Richard Allen Sears and Alva Curtis Roebuck. Who were Mitchell and Ness?
It was Frank P. Mitchell, and Frank's middle name was Peter. It's who I'm named after. And Frank P. Mitchell was an Englishman from Canada, though, and he also played tennis, squash, and he was a AAU champion wrestler. And Charles M. Ness came from, in Scotland, a golfing town right near where St. Andrews is. The two of them got together in 1904, and between 1904 and 1911, they actually had separate shops, but they were very close friends, and they decided to merge and create what we know as Mitchell & Ness. The Mitchell part was a tennis company, and the Ness part was a golf company. And the Ness part was very interesting. So from 1904 until 1929, Mitchell & Ness manufactured golf clubs. We're actually in the registries of wooden shafted golf club makers. So if you look in any of these documents or books that register who are the makers, what they did in those days was fascinating. Mr. Ness would import the mulberry heads, the hickory shafts, and the iron blades, and the leather wrappings from Scotland.
Wow.
They would come in, and all the golf pros in the Philadelphia area, I think my dad would tell me from Thanksgiving until March, would work at Mitchell & Ness assembling golf clubs.
Getting ready for the next season.
Well,
yeah.
The number of sets of clubs that they assembled was their allotment to sell as teaching pros, because there wasn't a lot of golf pro shops and retail stores that we know of in those days. And that's how golf grew, and Mitchell & Ness was very important in the manufacture of wooden shafted golf clubs. And there was tournaments Either the PGA or one of the major tournaments was played at a golf course called Cobbs Creek. And in the 1920s, my father would caddy for Walter Hagen. I don't know if you know who Walter Hagen is.
Yeah, absolutely.
He said he was just a real character.
Cool.
And then the very famous tennis player, Bill Tilden, who was maybe one of the greatest tennis players in the world, we strung all his rackets, and he spent a lot of time at Mitchell & Ness and was our ambassador. He died in 1963, but he was probably one of the greatest tennis players of all time, and he was a Mitchell & Ness loyalist.
Amazing. And so at what point did they start getting into making uniforms for local Philadelphia baseball and football teams? Because I know
Mr. Mitchell did more of that than Mr. Ness. Around 1925 is when they really began to start making baseball uniforms, and you would see the label of Mitchell & Ness in the uniforms. The first uniform that I can recall that I remember was a 1939 Philadelphia Athletics uniforms, and they did a lot of athletic uniforms all the way up till 1954. They did the Phillies uniforms probably 1942, 43, 44, and 45, but not too much after that.
But in 1933, they actually started with the Philadelphia Eagles, correct?
Yes. Mr. Mitchell was friendly with Bert Bell, who was the founder of the Eagles and then was the first commissioner of football. And so from 1933 until 1963, we were the official outfitters of everything that the Philadelphia Eagles wore. I'm talking everything, shoes to helmets. My claim to fame that is in the 1960 NFL championship game here in Franklin Field on December 26th, I helped Freddie Schuback, the equipment manager, put the face masks on.
Amazing.
For the helmets, and I was 15 years old, and I have great memories of the Eagles of that era. I essentially tell people I kind of grew up in the Philadelphia Eagles locker room.
There are worse ways to spend a childhood, right?
I know. I know.
So you were 15 when that happened. When did you start working at Mitchell & Ness?
Oh, no, I started working there at the time I was like 12 or 13.
Yeah. What were some of your first jobs? Like, what were you doing?
Well, when I was little, I was the errand boy. So I would come in, and they would have manufacturers located in the city who did lettering or who did manufacturing of clothing, and I would go over and push a three-wheeled cart in the streets and pick up the garments and bring them back to Mitchell & Ness. And then as I got a little bit older, I worked as a stock boy in our basement. We had a very large store on 13th and Arch Street that's no longer there. And then as I got into my teenage years, I worked in the store. I put a lot of face masks on helmets for clubs and for the Eagles. I mean, I know all the helmet styles and face mask styles. Worthless information, except for a couple collector friends of mine that we could talk about, nose guards that Larry Zonka wore in his helmet. I mean, who wants to know about that?
Collectors and historians.
I know.
Who would have thought? I mean, we'll get to what Mitchell & Ness became, but who would have thought that all the information that you were compiling was going to be worth something?
I'll tell you the worst mistakes I made, though. I never realized the value of the stuff that was lingering around the company. So, like old bats that were actually Major League players' bats, I'd get rid of them. Old uniforms that I thought we wouldn't sell anymore, they would go. In the old days, they had all different kinds of football cleats. They had mud cleats that were longer and then regular cleats and shorter cleats. And I thought to myself, as we modernized, who needs this stuff? So I'm sure I threw out a mountain of very valuable stuff. I shouldn't even admit to it.
That's all right. As a kid, you made scrapbooks from photographs that were in Sport magazine. Why was that something you felt compelled to do? Like, did you feel that you were documenting and preserving history, or was that just something that you used as a creative outlet?
For me, it was just fun, and they were very colorful. Sport magazine, which started before Sports Illustrated, probably in the middle 40s, they always featured multiple full-page color photographs in the Sport magazine. And in the front, they would tell you which pages and who they were. And I would cut them out and glue them into my scrapbook because I just thought they were beautiful.
Yeah.
They were more interesting to me than Sports Illustrated. And Sports Illustrated didn't really come along until 1954. There was an earlier Sports Illustrated in the late 40s, and I never saw many of those magazines. I didn't know much about them. But I just liked it as a kid and thought they were really colorful.
Do you still have those original scrapbooks?
No, I don't.
That's a shame. That'd be what a document that would be, right?
Yes.
Yeah. At what point then did you take over the business from your father?
Well, what happened was I had two brothers, two half-brothers. I'll bore you with this story. My father's best friend was a guy named Bud Klein, and he was a local politician, and he was Welshman. And he and Bud were best friends. And Bud got married to Jane Hunter and had 2 children, Hunter and Tony. And Bud died because he was allergic to penicillin, and they gave him a penicillin for pneumonia, and it killed him. So here he was with a widow and 2 children, ages 10 and 15. And my father married Bud's widow to bring up the 2 children. My father and Bud were that close. Those 2 children were my older half-brothers. They went on to things in the world of business and academic that surpassed a lot of what I did. My older brother Hunter was president of a branch of AT&T in the Virgin Islands called IT&T. And my brother Tony went to Harvard and became a very famous PhD sociologist, and they both passed away. But the point I'm trying to make is that neither one of them wanted to go into the sporting goods business. They had larger aspirations of what they wanted to do. I graduated from Susquehanna University in 1967. I went to officer candidate school and became an Army engineer officer in the Corps of Engineers and graduated as a second lieutenant. And I got lucky. I didn't get sent to Vietnam. I got sent to Korea. So I spent my 13 months up on the DMZ in 1968 and 69. When I got out of the service in September of 70, I thought I wanted to be a school teacher. I had taken education courses and gotten an additional degree at Temple, but my father got cancer. So it's 1970. None of my brothers wanted to come into the business. And I said, I love Mitchell and Ness. I've been there all my life. Let me give it a try. So I came in 1970, and I just stayed there, and I loved it. My dad eventually died in July of 1978, and that's when I fully took over. And that's when I really ran the business into the ground. Like any good son.
You told the Detroit Free Press in an interview, quote, "By 1983, all the expansion I had done had gone to hell. I fired 100 people, closed 2 warehouses. I reduced the company to a little store at 13th and Walnut Streets. It was down to just me and my wife." So you put your house up for sale for $80,000 in 1983, but nobody made you an offer. Why did you put your house on the market, and then what did you do when it didn't sell?
Boy, you had to remind me of all this. It's okay.
You were going to bring it up.
It all turned out fine. Yeah. But anyway, I didn't know what to do. I had overexpanded the business, borrowed too much money from the bank, was in great debt, and I knew that things were really bad. I had enough money to make what's called an informal creditor settlement, where I never declared formal bankruptcy. I got all my creditors together. I paid them all about 40% of what I owed them, which would have been much better than if I was in bankruptcy. They would have got 2%. Right. So I decided that I wanted to still stay in the tennis business, and I wanted to buy a small tennis shop in Newtown, Pennsylvania, run by a guy named Mark Weber. And he was about to retire and leave it. And I thought, well, if I sell my house for like $80,000, I could buy this tennis shop and keep going. Tennis was a big love of mine. I played a lot of tennis and fought. To this day, I even have the tennis channel. I watch it every night. But no one bought our house. It was a loft building on Front Street facing the Delaware River, and it was a big place. It was a warehouse building. We never got an offer. If I had gotten an offer to buy that house, I would have bought that little tennis shop, and you and I wouldn't even be sitting here.
Right.
I would have no idea who you were.
Isn't it funny how life works out sometimes?
It is unbelievable. I mean, I think about it, and I think how lucky I am. Don't think of myself as particularly smart or particularly sharp, but I think of myself as extraordinarily lucky.
But you also, even if you're given opportunities to have luck, you still need to be smart enough to capitalize on it.
Yes, I capitalized on it. Well, the interesting thing is when I moved over to this little store on 13th and Walnut Street, with just myself, my wife, and there was one other person, Joanne Graham, was with us too. I moved over there, and I still owed a lot of people money. And they would call every day, and I had some sporting goods and some sneakers, and I was eking out an existence. But above me in this building was the largest collection of dated periodicals in the world, 1,600,000 magazines.
Who did those belong to? Why were they there?
They belonged to a man named David Begelman, and he collected them and bought them and resold them, and it was a heritage thing that went down from his father. I mean, I'm talking every look, every life, every time, every Newsweek, every sporting news from the very first issue, every Sports Illustrated, every sport magazine, every dope book. I don't know if you've ever heard of the dope books. Every dope book. It was an unbelievable repository of things.
Does that collection still exist?
No, it's all gone.
Ugh.
Totally gone. So I would go up there and look in the magazines to hide from my creditors. And I was looking at all these old sport magazines, and you have to understand how I evolved. Between 1970 and, say, 1980, or maybe 81, that 11-year period, at Mitchell & Ness, I was the guy that wrote up all the specs for all the high school, college, bar league uniforms, and all those specs would go to manufacturers such as Russell Southern, Wilson, Sand Knit, Rawlings, companies you wouldn't know called Spangen, and other manufacturers around the country that we had relationships with. So I knew how to write on paper the specifics of uniform making, so the manufacturers would create the uniform that my customer wanted, and I would deliver it.
Yeah.
So I had 11 years of uniform specking and making in all kinds of fabrics and all kinds of colors. During that period of time, in 1972, the Miami Dolphins were a pretty good team.
You could say that.
And they had an aqua blue uniform. And Russell Corporation started making their uniform and offered that color. And me and a young employee of mine named Mike Robinson at the time said, you know, we could make those Miami Dolphin uniforms and nobody would know, and just order them as if a local team is ordering them. So we did it. And they came into the store. This is 1970. They came. People were saying, "My God, Dolphins uniforms!" Well, that sent, a light went off, and me and Mike, bless his soul, we started specking every uniform in the NFL. Completely illegal.
So you
completely
basically started
unlicensed.
as bootleggers.
Oh yeah, total bootleggers, and we made everything.
That's incredible.
And I had all of that knowledge, and I was only doing that for football. But I made a huge amount of baseball uniforms for high schools and colleges, church leagues, bar leagues, the Philadelphia Gay Softball League. I deemed it the City of Brotherly Love Softball League and made their logo.
Perfect.
That was a sad thing because I was making all their uniforms, and as the guys would die of AIDS, a lot of the parents would dissociate themselves from their children because they were gay, and they would be buried in my uniforms.
Wow.
And I would have to make fresh new uniforms for the guys for the viewings and funerals. We were located in what they call the Gayborhood in Philadelphia, and that was sad because I was very close friends with a lot of those guys.
But what does that tell you about how much you meant to them, that their friends that outlived them thought that would be a fitting thing for them to be buried in?
It was heartwarming.
Yeah.
It really was. But what happened is having the background and knowing how to do something.
Right.
When I moved over in 83, some people would come in, I guess you probably know this story, to get their vintage jerseys fixed.
Yeah.
Either I had to replace the felt, put a number on, the trim was wrong.
Not to cut you off, but were these vintage uniforms things that they had personally worn, or were they
they were
collectors?
They were collectors.
Okay, and so these were Major League Baseball game-worn uniforms.
Mostly St. Louis Browns I was doing, and the Pittsburgh Pirates. I think Bob Skinner's vest, those were the first two. Well, a local manufacturer called Maple Manufacturing, which was making all of my uniforms, that's where, when they were repairing them, that's where I stumbled on, I think it was like 12,000 yards of wool flannel. And this story's been a little bit documented. I asked Martin Sirkin, the owner of the manufacturer, I said, what do you do with all this wool flannel? And he said, well, they stopped wearing double knits. The way double knits came into existence, the Pirates were the first team in 1970. And the Red Sox were the last team in 1972. Dwight Evans and who was the other catcher? They had
Carlton Fisk.
Fisk.
Yeah.
They were the last guys to wear wool flannels. So I said, really? I said, it's just been sitting here. He says, yeah, we just use it for jacket linings.
And you were having this conversation in 1983. So this is about 11 years after.
1984, 85.
Okay.
Yeah. So I said, well, these jerseys that you're repairing for me, could you use some of that wool flannel and make me a few? He said, sure. So what I would do is the guys that brought in their jerseys to be repaired, I would say, not only will I repair this for you, but I'll make you a duplicate where the real collectors could tell the difference. But most people won't be able to tell the difference, and you can show them the authentic replica and keep this jersey, which is tens of thousands of dollars, keep it in the cedar closet. They said, that's a great idea.
Absolutely.
And I said, but I need to make 5 for myself, too. So they agreed.
Cool.
And that's where Tony Koki, my friend who we talked about, he and Dan Knoll from Chicago were big jersey collectors. And they would lend me jerseys and help me in the details of what I wanted to do.
So you started building this database of patterns and stitching patterns.
Yes.
And
I guess you could call it a database. It was scrapbooks.
yeah, but
Yeah.
that's essentially what you used it for then, is that when you would make a jersey later on, you could go back to those notes and say, this is exactly how the 1961 Pittsburgh Pirates uniform looked.
Yeah. And little details, like the Pirates didn't put numbers on the front of their jerseys till 1962. So Willie Stargell's jersey has a number on the front, but Clemente's doesn't.
Right.
You know. And the other thing was that sort of warmed my heart. I paid attention to the details. I also had a lot of information from the magazines upstairs. I didn't have any networking with the Baseball Hall of Fame. Major League Baseball had no idea who I was.
Not yet.
Not yet. But I really paid attention to the details, and I thought, you know, I'm making a memory, and it struck a chord with me that people have visual memories that are very detailed. And if you replicate that visual memory that's in their mind, it brings up emotions. So some of these jerseys, people were coming in almost crying and had never known that they could ever get their favorite player's jersey. I remember one guy came in, his name was Phil Baer, and he saw a Ted Williams jersey, and he was like in tears, and he pulls out his wallet, and Phil Baer was a big financial guy in the city, and he says, I've had this autograph of Ted Williams in my wallet since I was 12 years old. And he didn't care what the price of the jersey was, and he bought it. And I started to realize that I'm hitting a chord with people that I didn't realize, and it was very rewarding for me. I never thought I was going to get this big and this successful. It was just a fun thing to do.
And so there is a distinction between Mitchell and Ness, the retail store, and the Mitchell and Ness Nostalgia Company. Why did you have to do that?
Okay, solely a financial thing. Well, let me first start out with how I got to there.
Yeah.
You know, you probably know this, but Sports Illustrated, in their baseball issue in 1987, did a full page on me, and then that's when baseball decided to sue me. They brought me up to Major League Baseball headquarters, and Major League Baseball sued me, or threatened to sue me, and I came up to Major League Baseball's headquarters, and I brought, I probably bought 30 or 40 different jerseys, and I laid them out, and they said, we've never seen anything like this. Would you like a license? And I said, sure.
It beats getting sued, right?
Yes. And I turned around to my wife when we left Major League Baseball's office, and I said, Fran, we're going to get rich. So we left there in 1987, and in 1988 is when we first started.
When you first started the Mitchell and Ness Nostalgia
Company.
Okay.
Now, the Mitchell and Ness Nostalgia Company is the company that held all the licenses, because the way it works when you're working with the leagues, you just can't be a retailer and sell people coming out in the street. I had to make uniforms originally for all the 16 original Major League teams, the teams from 1876 up and through 1962 until there was expansion. But then I made everything through 69 and later. But I have to have wholesale distribution. They don't want a royalty from a company that's just selling to people coming in.
Right.
I had to prove that I could sell all over the country to other retailers. Luckily, I had a lot of loyal manufacturers who had seen me through rougher times and trusted me and recognized that I was doing something a little different. So the Mitchell and Ness Nostalgia Company was the wholesale branch that held the licensing rights, manufactured all the clothing, and sold it to other stores all over the country, including the Mitchell and Ness store. So I had two corporations going at the same time, a Mitchell and Ness store and the Mitchell and Ness Nostalgia. It was nice because I used the same staff for both companies, and it managed to work for me. So from 1988 until 1997, I only did baseball. And I can't tell you, I mean, I can in some ways. People always ask me, how many different jerseys have I made? It's in the thousands.
Oh, yeah.
If you include player numbers, it's 2,000, 3,000, 4,000.
Yeah.
Now, if you just include player styles, it's probably 700 or 800 or 900.
Yeah, easily.
In baseball.
Yeah. There's a handful of different names for the pieces of clothing that you guys specialized in. People call them retro uniforms or throwbacks or heritage jerseys. When you guys would talk about them in-house, how would you refer to them? What would you call them?
I would just call it the Cooperstown Authentic Collection. Throwbacks is a name that the NFL came up with in 1992. I didn't come up with throwbacks, but people attach that word to everything.
Right.
Yeah, no.
When you solidified the idea that making old uniforms was something feasible for your company and that you were going to start doing it, how did the brainstorming sessions go where you decided which jerseys you were going to start doing?
I just made the jerseys of guys I liked.
Okay.
If I didn't like the guy, I didn't make a jersey. So people always ask me, wow, you must have had a great marketing strategy, or you must. I said, no. I mean, I made all my childhood heroes. I made all the jerseys of guys that I liked. If there was a player, and I'm not going to name the players I don't like. You can probably guess, So.
Do you remember the first one you made when you started doing this for yourself and not just doing the replicas of the ones that your customers brought in? You're like, oh, I need to make 5 for myself.
Yeah, sure. I started making Richie Ashburn of the Philadelphia Phillies. And it was one of the first. I made a lot of Jackie Robinson. I made a lot of Willie Mays. I made Duke Snyder. I made Hank Aaron a lot. He used to really drive me crazy. He swore he never wore a zipper front jersey. So finally, I just agreed with him. You're not going to argue with Hank Aaron. The players, I found over the years, the players pay relatively little attention to their uniforms compared to us as fans.
Right.
You'd be surprised, except for Rose. There was a period of time where every game Rose changed his uniform.
Wow.
Every single game, so he could sell it. It's enough about Pete Rose. But there's something else that I did that I really liked. It was actually the more difficult research than the jerseys. It was all the warm-up jackets, coaches' jackets, and managers' jackets, and batting shirts, because there wasn't a lot of research on that. And
they weren't well documented at the time.
They
because
weren't.
People didn't care about those. They cared about the uniforms.
Right. And so I did find some real ones.
Yeah.
I did have enough specs to understand how to make them, and I liked making the jackets. I probably sold tens of thousands of the jackets, and they were great, great pieces of history. Oh, I should interject now. My closest friend in this business is Jerry Cohen at Ebbets Field Flannels. Jerry and I have been I'm more like his father. Since I'm 77, Jerry's just 63. Not his father, but his older brother. Jerry has just recently acquired the rights to MLB to do the vintage jackets.
Right.
And he has the rights to the NFL to do the vintage jerseys and jackets. And I'm not part of Ebbets Field Flannels, but I push Jerry in the direction of who are the right manufacturers and help him with what jerseys and what jackets to make.
Yeah.
And I do it all informally, but I love it, and I love watching Jerry sort of recreating what I created.
Right.
And he's doing a fabulous job.
Yeah, that announcement a couple months back when he said, all right, these are the first Major League Baseball jackets I'm doing, and these are the first NFL ones. It was incredible to see the accuracy, and the materials are perfect, and the colors are perfect.
For his jerseys, he's using the same manufacturers that I use.
Yeah.
For his jackets, he's got one manufacturer that I use, but 3 up in the Seattle and Portland area, and his stuff is beautiful. His stuff is magnificent.
I'm also a huge jersey collector, so this stuff matters to me, Color photography didn't really become a thing until about 1938. Right. So when you would do research about baseball uniforms from back then or earlier than that, how would you go about finding what colors the uniforms were if you didn't have a real example?
Well, it was an interesting exercise. I had an older man named Paul Polgarin. Paul passed away. And I would send Paul to the Philadelphia Public Library, but I also had other people, Bill Lipinski from Chicago, Congressman Lipinski. Those guys, I would give them assignments, and they would go to the libraries and look in the microfiche for certain years. The one example was a microcosm is the 1937 Brooklyn Dodgers. Nobody knew what the colors were. And even the most prominent collector and buyer and seller, Tony Koki, based in Atlanta, he didn't know, or if he knew, he'd never seen one.
Right.
What they would do is the sports writers in that era, the day before opening day, the day of opening day, and the day after opening day, those 3 issues of newspapers were bound to say the colors of the new uniforms. Because as you might know, what happens is in spring training, the team usually wears the uniform they wore last year, and they don't break out a new uniform until opening day.
Right.
So I learned about the Brooklyn Dodgers, and I still have the newspaper article
of
1937
That says what?
Well, they came out in their white and Kelly green uniforms.
Right.
And their road uniforms were a khaki tan and green, and their jacket was a forest green uniform with Kelly green buttons.
And why did they do it that particular year?
Because they were so bad for luck. They wanted to change their luck.
Right.
And that only lasted 1 year. And then in 1938, they went back to Dodger blue. But I would have never known anything like that. And I used that kind of newspaper research for hundreds of uniforms. And I can't tell you how many libraries my people went to. And we used that formula before opening day, and after. And the sports writers invariably wrote, because there was no color,
right,
about the colorful uniforms.
You mentioned Paul Polgarian, but also Bob Downs was somebody who helped with your research, right?
Bob was wonderful. Yeah, Bob passed away. He was a banker with Philadelphia Federal Reserve. Bob possessed a collection of baseball caps, and he was really a Baltimore Orioles specialist. And I got rights to do baseball caps, and Bob helped me in that cap world immensely for years. You know, and I paid attention to uniforms because I knew how to make them. The collectors knew more details than I knew. And one of the things that I pride myself in is that my ego wasn't so big that I got defensive if somebody told me that something I was doing was inaccurate or,
Right.
or it was wrong.
Yeah.
Because actually I liked that. I encouraged it because they were doing the work for free.
Right.
And so they're helping me, and as I evolved, the jerseys got better and better and better.
Yeah, so the collectors knew the details and the specifics of a particular uniform
That they loved.
but you knew how to execute it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Before this kind of stuff was so readily available on the internet with sites like sportslogos.net or even Mark Okenen's work.
I worked with Mark, helped him with that book, both books. I loved Mark.
Yeah.
I was very sad at his passing.
Sometimes it would take literally years to hunt down the proof of colors or designs on patches or lettering or things like that. What were a couple really challenging pieces early on that made recreating a particular jersey or jacket or warm-up sweater, things like that? What were some very difficult ones early on that you remember?
The 1917 World Series White Sox.
Why?
Well, because the flag was so difficult to figure out and make, and then it was actually a three-layer SOX, and it was a navy and red and white trim collar. I didn't have any colors. I don't think I've ever seen a real one. Maybe there's a real one at the Baseball Hall of Fame. I have never been to the Baseball Hall of Fame.
I'm going tomorrow. You want to come with me?
No. But
That's surprising that you've never been there.
Never been there.
You're
but
so close.
Well, I'll tell you about that. Peter Clark was one of the curators there, and there's a woman there now who's a curator that I work with quite a bit on sweaters. My real hobby now is vintage sweaters from 1901 through 1930. But in the early days, I sent a box of all of my jerseys up to the Hall of Fame. Had to have been 88 or 89. Because I was still a little insecure, and they opened them all up, and they were in shock at how close they were and loved them. And that gave me a lot of confidence that I was doing it correctly.
And so was that the start of the Cooperstown collection?
The start of the Cooperstown collection was in September of 1988 when I got my license. A guy named Rick White was at the head of Major League Baseball Properties then, and they created the name Cooperstown Collection. I added the word authentic in the middle because Cooperstown Collection was just a collection of T-shirts and different things. And I said, well, I'm not that. And so we made a gold logo, and then we put the word authentic throughout the middle of it. Just for me, I had the exclusive rights to that.
Yeah.
And so that's how that began.
Did Major League Baseball have other companies working with them to create products in the Cooperstown collection line, or was that all you?
Oh, no, they had tons of other companies, but I had exclusive rights for everything authentic.
Okay.
And then the way it worked is it had to be 5 years prior to the current season, and it had to have something different than what the current team was wearing.
Right.
Like with the Yankees, it was challenging.
Right.
But I had all the patches, and so
Perfect.
I was able to use different patches.
So like the 1939 season with the baseball centennial, things like that.
The 51,
Right.
the 52. Then if there was any armbands or numbers for commemorative people who passed away. So, I got around to using all of those things.
With the Yankees, they're one of the classic baseball teams, this rich history. What about another team from the National League, the Cardinals? They have an interesting story about how they came up with their logo.
Right. The St. Louis Cardinals, the two birds on the bat, that goes all the way back to 1922 and 1923. And it's the story that I like the best in baseball. In 1922, Branch Rickey was the vice president of the St. Louis Cardinals. And the St. Louis Cardinals used to have spring training in Ferguson, Missouri. And a woman named Ellie Mae Schmidt of the Presbyterian Church Brotherhood Association had invited Branch in February of 1921 to a luncheon. And she didn't know how to decorate the luncheon place settings. And she looked out the window and she saw on the branch of a tree 2 cardinal birds perched. She said, "Oh, that would be cool. I'll cut off some branches and I'll make some cutout cardinal birds and I'll put them at the front of every place setting at this Presbyterian church luncheon for Branch Rickey." This is true. Now, Rickey comes, he sees it, he's so taken back by it, it's so beautiful that's what the Cardinals came out with on the front of their jerseys in 1922.
Amazing.
Now, at that time, there was a company called the Levy Group in 1922 in Chesterfield, Missouri. They were just coming into existence and making uniform lettering and logos. They were the ones that was contracted with to do the 2 Cardinals on a black bat.
On a black bat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Levy Company exists today. Dave Eshelman is the general manager, and Billy Levy, the son of I guess you would call him the founder, or his father's father, is still there. And the Levy Company did most of the lettering on all the jerseys from the 20s up until the present day.
Wow.
Of all of the Rawlings and Wilson and another company called Goodman in the West Coast. They possess the paper patterns and all the research and the history and kept records of everything they did.
Wow.
And they were my major makers forever.
What a resource.
And they're wonderful, wonderful people and a wonderful resource. And the Cardinals story I discovered, you know, when I said the magazine shop above my store had every sporting news, that was a story that I clipped out of a 1943 Sporting News, and I still have it. And that's how I discovered it. And then when I said to Levy, I told him about this. He said, "Oh, yeah, we did them." I said, "Really? Can you do a few for me? Like maybe a few thousand?"
Amazing.
Sure.
Because there was one year where the Cardinals uniform had a different color bat, right? And that was...
Well, that gold bat for 1951.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there was 1 year, I forget if it was either 50, I think it was 56. They used the word Cardinals on the front, and the fans revolted,
Right.
And then back to the birds. And for the real collectors, and you say you're a real collector, the difference between the 1964 Cardinals jersey and the 1967 Cardinals jerseys, the tail feathers on the birds on the bats are reversed. And when you look, you can tell which is a 64 and which is a 67. Now, if you knew that, then I would say you're in worse shape than me.
Well, one is in front of the bat and one is behind the bat, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
But then the other one is in front or behind, but it's on the opposite side.
Right.
You knew that?
Like I said, I kind of like this stuff.
You knew that.
I did. I went to school in Carbondale, Illinois, at Southern Illinois University, and most people who live in that area were Cardinals fans. So I had a lot of Cardinals friends, and
All right. I'm gonna ask you another trivia
go for
question. All right. In 1939, the very famous 100th anniversary of baseball patch. What is the difference between the ones on the minor league uniforms and the ones on the major league uniforms?
The face is angled a little bit differently, isn't it?
You're unbelievable.
Like I said.
Very good.
Thank you very much.
I'm very impressed. I'm totally impressed.
I appreciate that.
All right.
We kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, but there have been more than 20,000 players in the history of baseball, and nearly all of them have worn more than one uniform in their career when you consider the fact that almost all players have at least worn a home uniform and an away jersey of one team. But different years for the same team often have different styles. So like the 1917 White Sox uniform is slightly different than the 1919 White Sox uniform, things like that. So this venture of you creating these throwback uniforms, it very easily could have been an endless project if you just stuck to only baseball. How did you guys stop yourselves from letting your eyes get bigger than your stomach, so to speak?
Well, mostly because they were too close and it gets too repetitive. And there's a point where you have to see what your customers want and what they're willing to buy and look. So if a 1917 was representational of 16 or 18, or they wore slightly different trims. You just do one and move on. I couldn't go crazy with it, although I essentially did go crazy with some of it. And I can't even remember I made so many jerseys. I mean, there's all these Mitchell & Ness jersey collector sites on Facebook, and there's thousands of my jerseys and asking me questions, and sometimes I'm at a loss to remember so much stuff that I did.
Yeah.
But I did slow it down. I'll tell you, with Jackie Robinson, between 1952 and 1956, the Dodgers had slightly different style number 42s for him. And in 1955, I found 2 team photos, one with a 42 that was thin and pointed, another with a 42, which is the flat plain block, So I had to choose. I'm not going to do both.
Right.
Do one or the other. And the other thing is that in those days, there was lots of local companies that were making things, and the teams themselves would take off numbers and put on numbers. So standardization was not as great in the early days as it is today.
Yeah.
And so I went with the one that was most recognizable.
How does the licensing work on stuff like this? So like if you're making the 1955 Jackie Robinson Brooklyn Dodgers home uniform, do you have to pay Major League Baseball, the Los Angeles Dodgers, and the estate of Jackie Robinson?
No, just baseball and the estate of Jackie Robinson. The way baseball is set up, it's a C corporation with 30 shareholders in the C corporation. And this is one of the things that Steinbrenner hated so much. What happens is Major League Baseball Properties collects the royalties and then splits the profits 30 equal ways. So you get a license with baseball, you pay them the royalties, and then they split up. But Steinbrenner was so angry because the Yankees generated 27% of all the revenue in licensed products, and he was getting 1/30. He didn't like that.
Yeah.
He sued baseball one year. And he also tried to trademark pinstripes. And I even had to testify that the Yankees were not the first team to wear pinstripes. There was a lot of, I don't know who. I mean, a lot of them wore them early. Cubs wore them. The White Sox wore pinstripes. There was a lot. Cincinnati Reds wore pinstripes. But Steinbrenner won, and then he wanted Brooks Brothers to pay him royalties. I mean, it was incredible.
Yeah. So do you pay based on how many are sold or how many are manufactured?
No, how many are sold.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And are the licensing rates different for a player who's a little bit more obscure? Like, does it cost more to make a superstar than it does to make a guy who most people don't really know?
Well, it depends. If you're making jerseys where there was no player name or number on them, you don't have to deal with the player.
Interesting.
So if you're dealing with a jersey where there's a player name on him, you got to pay the player. So the royalty to the leagues is standard for every team. All right. But players like to negotiate their own royalties and think how valuable they are or not. I had a standard royalty rate. In those days, I was paying 9% of the wholesale price to the player and 9 or 10% of the wholesale price to the leagues. Today, all these rates are skyrocketing.
Yeah.
I'm glad I'm out of it. But the players, it fluctuated a bit, and the leagues, it was always standard.
What about, we mentioned how not every uniform had a player name or even a number on the back. So like if you did an 1892 Cleveland Spiders uniform, they were members of the National League back then, but that franchise no longer exists. It's not like it was renamed or relocated. It's straight up defunct. So they had a player who a lot of people know, Cy Young. So if you made that uniform, people would know that it was a Cy Young uniform, but would you market it that way? Or if you marketed it that way, would you have to then pay royalties to the Cy Young estate? Like how does that stuff work?
I would market it just the history of the team that year. And I could use Cy Young's name in a mix of other names of who the team players were.
Interesting.
And that's how I would do it.
Yeah. Did you care about teaching people about the history of these players and teams in sports? Like, was it your intent when you made a Bill Russell jersey to be able to teach young fans about who he was? Or was that stuff happening on its own and just kind of a happy accident?
A little bit of both. Some of it was a happy accident. Some of it was that I felt that players should be recognized and known for what they did. And I would write little histories. My catalogs had histories. I put histories. You don't see a lot of my hang tags from the early days that actually had little histories. Yeah. They were on almost the size of 3x5 cards on the jerseys. So, yeah, I like the history and I like the player. Was I intent? I don't know that I was intent, but when I would make, like you use the Boston Celtics, I made a lot of their jerseys, and I would give lectures, and I would talk about Bill Russell and his history, and even his college history. But I was not driven to teach people about the history of baseball. What I figured was the people who were buying my products loved the history of baseball.
Yeah.
I wasn't driven to teach non-interested people in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Only so much I could do.
Right, yeah. We've kind of now covered about how you got into this and how things started progressing. Tell me about a store in Atlanta called Distant Replay.
My favorite store. Andy Hyman, I talked to him today. Distant Replay came into existence in, I think, 1998. And Andy started it as a nostalgia store, and he bought from me and from Jerry at Ebbets Field, but he really built the business on me. What I didn't know was, you know who DMC is, Darryl McDaniels?
I don't know him personally like you do, but I know who he is.
So Darryl used to send me all his music all the time. And so one time we were at an NBA All-Star event, and he says, "Did you listen to my music?" I said, "No, I hate your music. I'm not listening to it." So he starts laughing. He said, "What'd you do?" I said, "I give it to all my young employees." So he goes, "Well, what do you like?" And I go, "John Denver, John Davidson, and Barry Manilow." So he looks at me and goes, "I love John Denver, but you can never tell anybody."
That's funny.
And we were going to Vegas to a Barry Manilow, John Davidson concert, and he said he'd go with me.
Amazing.
But anyway, the reason I'm telling you that story is my knowledge in general of music is very limited, but my knowledge of hip-hop and rap music is zero. Mm-hmm. And when Andy came into existence in 1998, the hip-hop and rap scene in Atlanta was so strong that, you know, it began with Big Boy and Andre, who I both, now I know both. I know all these guys. Yeah. I mean, little old white guy here in Philadelphia, you can't believe my rapper list of guys I know. So they started wearing. Andy came in 1998. These guys started coming in and wearing stuff. But my wife is a very quiet, silent partner in this business. She worked with me and ran the business with me the entire time. We had no children. We ran the business together. She ran the financial side, the HR side. She ran all of the accounts payable and receivables, all the royalties. She managed the company in a way that I was not disciplined and could have never done.
What was her background? How did she know how to do all that stuff, or did she just have to figure it out?
You know what her background was? She graduated from art school. And people say, "What?" I don't think you understand, but when you become a really fine artist, mm-hmm. you're trained in many disciplines that you have to know prior to the final product. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of working drawings, there's a lot of outlining, there's a lot of detail work that goes into a painting where people think, oh, they're just sitting on an easel and with a brush. That's the tip of the iceberg. Mm-hmm. My wife is an extraordinarily detail-minded woman. She also worked to make a living in some retail fashion stores where she worked in the accounting department too. Mm-hmm. So that combined with everything else, when I asked her to marry me, we had just declared bankruptcy in 83. I said, it can't get any worse. Let's get married. And I said, but you have to come work for me. I don't have any employees. And she did. But the other thing that she did, and she's 8 years younger than me, the other thing that she did, which is going to lead to Andy Hyman and Distant Replays and Big Boy and Andre, the other thing she did is she says, Peter, you're an old fart. You're making all these baseball jerseys of the people that you remember and love. How about the people that are 20 and 30 years younger than you, yeah, who are their baseball heroes of their childhood? Why don't you make more modern vintage baseball jerseys?
Like Dale Murphy and Nolan Ryan.
I said, sure, okay. Mm-hmm. I'll try it. Mm-hmm. To me, they were current.
Right.
So I made the Nolan Ryan Rainbow Astros. Mm-hmm. I made the Dale Murphy. Mm-hmm. And then here's these rappers in Atlanta buying them and especially Dale Murphy. I was like, you're wearing this white boy jersey?
But he was Atlanta.
He was Atlanta.
And they're Atlanta. Yeah. So, yeah.
And they loved the color schemes. Yeah. And those two guys began, and then there was a parade of hip-hop artists and rappers that came through Distant Replays.
You described that store as a nostalgia store, and obviously you named your company the Ness Nostalgia Company. What does that word nostalgia mean to you? Why is that an important word for you?
Well, nostalgia means to me fond memories, and it means to me great memories and things that I love and make me feel good. That's the real meaning of nostalgia to me, People always say, what is your mission statement? Big corporations all have to have a mission statement. I never knew there was such a thing as a mission statement. But my mission statement was to accurately recreate the history of baseball through the evolution of the uniform. I had to make up a mission statement. I thought that's a good one, and that
Yeah.
really describes what we do. So
Absolutely.
we're recreating the history. Then I evolved it, the history of professional sports, because of all the other leagues I did through the evolution of the uniforms.
Who is Reuben Harley?
Big Rube came to me in 2001, and he said, Peter, you've got a really hot product here. I think I can help you get it on some people that'll even make it bigger. So I said, really, Rube, what are you going to do? He says, well, I can go to tapings of concerts and tapings of rap videos. And he said, these guys will be comfortable with me. Rube was 345 pounds of a big man. Mm-hmm. And he was my product placement guy from 2001 to 2006. And he placed product for me on a lot of very famous entertainers. And it was integral to the growth. It helped the growth greatly. Although I would get in trouble sometimes. I used to be interviewed on MTV, and I was actually interviewed on ABC, the morning show, with Matt Lauer once, I think. And they used to say, Peter, do you watch MTV? And I would say, I watch MTV, BET, and VH1 every single night. And the guys would say, really? What music do you like? And then I would say, this is what got me in big trouble, I don't watch it with the sound on. Right. I just want to see who's wearing my stuff. So that got me in trouble.
But if that's not the type of music you're into.
Well, Big Rube brought in one time Fat Joe. Uh-huh. I got beat up. You know the story about me getting beat up by Fat Joe?
No.
So Rube brings in Fat Joe. Big Pun had just died and left Fat Joe his tour bus. So Fat Joe comes in with Macho, his right-hand man, and a few other guys. And Rube says, Peter, you want to meet Fat Joe? I said, okay. So I come down from the balcony office, and there's these 5 fat guys in combat boots, hoodies, and dark jeans, and they all look the same. And I go, well, which one of you's Fat Joe? You all look alike. So Fat Joe pulls me over, puts me in a stranglehold. I said, okay, what do you want, Fat? And he goes, I want a Mike Schmidt jersey. So I said, oh, you're too fat. I can't make it for you. So Allen Iverson calls me, and they're good friends. Mm-hmm. And he says, Peter, you got to make this jersey for Fat Joe. I said, all right. I measured him up, and I made this huge Mike Schmidt jersey for Fat Joe. So he comes back like 6 or 8 weeks later to get it, and he's even fatter, and it doesn't fit him. So then I renamed him on MTV to Fat Joe. So he's at a Sixer game with Reuben, and he sees me in the corridor, and he tackles me. And he starts hammering on me. He says, yo, Peter, why are you dishing me on MTV? So that's my Fat Joe story.
That's a good one. You mentioned Allen Iverson. In March of 1999, he appeared on the cover of Slam magazine wearing a throwback Philadelphia uniform in what has become one of the iconic basketball magazine covers of all time. But that was a custom uniform, right? It was in the style of the 1966 Philadelphia 76ers, but it was Iverson's number 3 with his name on the back. So how did all of that play out? Did Allen come to you ahead of time, or the people at Slam, and say, we have this idea for a shoot, but we need you to make us this jersey? Like, how did that happen?
I can't remember. I'm sorry.
All right.
I'm sorry. It
was a great question, though, right?
It was a great question. The other thing, magazine cover, which I think of, is Kobe. And Kobe would wear the Sixers jersey, number 23. Mm-hmm. Well, all the young kids that would come into the store, they'd look at this jersey and they go, oh, man, look, a Kobe jersey with Jordan's number on it. How cool. And I'm going, no, that's Kobe's father.
Right.
They would pick that up, and I knew Kobe's dad. I never met Kobe Bryant in person myself. He was a big customer along with Shaq and a lot of other guys. And I met Shaq many times, but I never had the chance to meet Kobe, which I regret.
And he was a huge supporter of your guys. In the 2002 playoffs, he famously wore a bunch of different Mitchell and Ness creations from great athletes in all sports history, not just basketball. Also in 2002, while hosting the American Music Awards, Sean Combs wore a Hank Aaron Braves jersey. Mm-hmm. Jay-Z started wearing throwback jerseys on stage during the Hard Knock Life tour and during his Girls, Girls, Girls music video. Like, you were blowing up as a company from 1998 to about 2002. How did your revenue grow from those years?
Immensely. In 1994 was the baseball strike, so the 95 season started late. It almost put us out of business. 96 and 97, we were doing very little business. 98, I finally got the NBA license, and it started to get bigger. So in 98, we were probably doing about $2 million worth of business. 99 and 2000, it got up to like 3 or 4 million. 2001, it got to like 12 million. 2002, it exploded to 22 million. 2003, it went to 40 million. 2004, it kept going. And I'm a small businessman with not a lot of big business experience. And I had to really scramble. I built warehouses and distribution centers on the fly, increased computer systems. It was very, very challenging.
But not just the logistics side of fulfilling orders, but how about sourcing materials? Like, how did you guys handle that growth?
Well, we had good domestic sources, but we had a guy named Scott Soffen who came to me from Starter. And Scott had a lot of contacts in China and Korea. And he was able to fulfill huge volumes of orders for me. I must have met Scott in 2000 or 2001. We were making way more in China and Korea than we were making in the U.S. Now, some of that was because it was efficient and the prices were better, but some of it was because fabrics were not available to me in the U.S., that local manufacturers in the U.S., especially in the world of football, could not make for me. And I had to go offshore to get them made. So it happened quickly. We had the resources and were able to pay for our goods and write what they call letters of credit. And it was, I'm very proud of it. It was phenomenal. Not many people can grow a company from 2 million to 40 million in 3 years.
Right.
It was quite a growth spurt.
When you knew somebody big like Jay-Z or Outkast or somebody along those lines, somebody huge like that who had legitimate influence on the culture, when you knew that they were into Mitchell and Ness and would wear your jerseys on stage during concerts or in music videos or in photo shoots, would you give them those jerseys for free and consider it part of your advertising budget because you knew that the money that you'd make once the public saw them would be well worth that $300 jersey? You're making those people still pay for the product?
Yeah,
Amazing.
The more they paid for it, the more they appreciated it.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize what was happening. I didn't know. And I'll tell you my all-time favorite story because it has to do with Jay-Z and girls, girls, girls. You know, and a little confession. I don't know that much about baseball. People think I'm like the baseball knowledgeable guy in the country. I'm not. But I know a lot about football, an awful lot. And in the history of football, I loved Sammy Baugh. And I only made his jersey because I loved him. I mean, it's the ugliest. It's a maroon jersey with a number 33 on it. And I'm just going to bore you with some Sammy Baugh statistics.
Let's hear them.
Sammy Baugh, between 1937 and I think he finally retired in 52. Sammy Baugh, as a quarterback, he led the league in passing completions. He led the league in touchdowns. He led the league in yardage. 43 through 47, he led the league in punting average. His season punting average was not broken until 2016 or 17.
Wow.
In 1942, he led the league in interceptions.
Defensive interceptions.
He was the safety.
Right.
I mean, who can do that?
Right. Not just a two-way player, a three-way player, because he was special teams also.
Yeah, who can do that? Nobody.
Right.
So I said, oh, screw it. I've got to make a Sammy Baugh jersey. So I made his, I think it was 47 or 48 jersey. I don't know how Jay-Z got it. If he bought it from me or he bought it from Big Rube, I can't honestly remember. He gets this jersey and he wears it on this video, Girls, Girls, Girls. It played for 18 months, like 15 times a day.
Right.
It became by far the best-selling jersey I ever made in my company, okay? Now, I would pay Sammy royalties, okay? And Fran would make out the checks. Sammy Baugh, south of the mountain, Rotan, Texas. And he would get his royalty checks. So one day, and then Sammy died in either 2008 or 2009. I think like December 2008, something like that. One day, Sammy calls me and with his Texas accent. And he says, Peter, I have no idea why you're sending me all this money. I was sending Sammy between $2,000 and $5,000 a month.
Wow.
He says, I have no idea why you're sending me all this money, Peter, but it's more money than I ever made in the NFL, and I just want to thank you. And I said, Sammy, you're a legend. Your accomplishments will never be forgotten. I never in my life had the heart to tell him why. I'm sure he went to his deathbed having no idea.
Yeah, thinking all of a sudden he just had this rejuvenation of
Everybody
fans. Yeah.
loves, and I love Sammy. So.
Yeah, what a great story. I've heard and read interviews with rappers where they talk about how they wanted the uniform that they wore in their video or on stage to be the first time anyone had ever seen that uniform, that they wanted obscure players or teams or colors so they could be original, almost like it was a competition, that having exclusivity helped them win.
Drove me out of my mind.
What were some of the strange requests? Like, would you fulfill requests?
No, I just made what I made. They had to find it. I couldn't do it. No. And I made so much that even if they bought something that other people bought, so few people bought. A lot of things I made only one run of. I would only make 48 or 72 pieces and never make it again. And I was on to making the next thing.
Yeah.
So I would do some of these ABA teams and things like that. And I just kept making more teams that I researched and found colorful, and that the Libby Group had logos of, and that my manufacturers could make. And it was just so much fun. And it was fun to research the things, but I didn't respond directly to what the players would always call me and say, well, I want to be the first guy to have this jersey so I can show my friends. And I would just say, okay, you're the first guy. What could I do? It was, It got to be too much.
Were people even that literate 20 years ago in terms of jersey history? Like, were people asking for, I want the 1986-87 Dominique Wilkins red Atlanta Hawks jersey?
Some were and some weren't.
Because today it's not uncommon for people to be able to tell you the exact years that teams wore a specific jersey and when they made subtle changes or completely overhauled their look. But before Mitchell and Ness made throwbacks cool, was that something the average person could really do?
No, not the average person. It was my business for years, when I started really doing it, from 1985 until the end of where I only did baseball, 1998, my customer base was white, college-educated, conservative males who were into baseball statistics and baseball nuts. That's who they were, and that's who I was appealing to. And that's where I was driving my business to, because that's who was buying everything. By 1997, 98, Andy Hyman opened up. Things started to really expand greatly. And I just decided, keep doing what I'm doing. Don't change and be something else just because another market was interested. Now, my only compromise that I did do was I made enormous sizes. Guys wanted big sizes. The biggest size I ever made in anything up through 1997 was a size 52. By the time 2000 and something rolled along, I was making size 70.
Right.
Iverson was buying size 64 jerseys.
They're like dresses.
No, upholstery covers for chairs.
Yeah. You guys were legitimately trendsetters in the literal sense that you were setting the trends. I mean, you were deciding what was going to be cool. You weren't giving people what they wanted. You were telling them what they wanted. Did that power ever go to your head that, like, you could make a player like Sammy Baugh cool again?
No, I never thought about it that way. No, I didn't. I just thought about what I liked and what I wanted to make. There were certain uniforms that I liked because I made a lot of high school and college uniforms. Certain uniforms I liked just because of the colors. I mean, I made the Chargers uniforms.
Yeah, those powder blue.
Yeah, powder blue Lance Allworths because of the colors. And then the Chargers had 3 or 4 different colors. And I liked Johnny Unitas, and he ended his career as a Charger. So I made all the Johnny Unitas jerseys because I liked him.
Yeah.
I talked to Johnny Unitas a day or two before he died.
Oh, wow.
He had an auto dealership of some sort, and it was in an office there, and it was very, very sad. So no, I don't think anything ever went to my head. Although it's been an interesting ride for me to learn a whole culture and a whole world that I'd never been exposed to. But a very, very decent crowd of people, and a lot of the entertainers that I got to know, they didn't trust the white sports media or the white news media, but for some reason, a lot of those guys trusted me and opened up to me in a lot of things.
Why do you think that was?
I think it was because they knew that I shared a love of history with them in sports, and people didn't know. They knew, a lot of the athletes know more about sports history than you can imagine. And so we shared a lot of that history of love of sports, and they knew that I was not being dishonest or promotional minded with a lot of the guys.
You weren't exploiting them.
No, not a lot of the guys. And they knew what I was about, and that I was not a music guy, and that I wasn't going to understand a lot of the music that catapulted those guys to fame. So I had a lot of nice relationships. To this day, I still do. Biz Marquis was one of my best buddies.
Yeah.
It broke my heart. I talked to Biz 2 months before he passed away.
Yeah, I saw he DJ'd at the flagship store a couple times.
And he DJ'd for me at some of the NBA All-Star games, too.
Right.
And I had a store in Tokyo. You may not have even known this.
No.
For 2 years, and I opened up and I brought DMC over for the opening.
Cool.
Of the store in Tokyo in 2005.
Wow. So when you first started making throwbacks, it was because you found all that wool flannel lying around. So naturally, the first uniforms you recreated were from an era where the uniforms were made of wool flannel. When manufacturers started using other materials like polyester, nylon, and even cotton, how did recreating uniforms from those eras change the way that you had to do things?
Well, when you make wool flannel uniforms, you can make 6 or 12 at a time. It's all hand-cut work. It's easy to do. To make the double knit uniforms, you had to run quantities of probably, I don't think I ever ran less than 48 pieces, most of the time 144. When I was making things offshore, it had to be 300 pieces, sometimes 1,200 pieces at a time.
Wow.
So you had to be a little more strategic in what you were going to make and knew that it was going to sell, or your inventory investments would mount. So it was a little trickier, but I still made a lot of different double knits. I made so many Cincinnati Reds double knits I can't remember. I still see them on the collector sites.
Yeah.
You know? Oh, you know the other thing that I made that I liked? I made satin uniforms.
Yes.
I made them for the Cincinnati Reds, who you may not know. I made them for the Detroit Tigers. I made them for the St. Louis Cardinals. I made them for the Boston Braves. And, of course, I made them for the Brooklyn Dodgers.
Right. Why did those satin uniforms exist?
I think it was because of nighttime baseball, and they wanted to see them shine off the lights, but they didn't breathe very well.
Right.
And they were not very popular. I'll tell you, to this day, uniforms in 1970 to 72 that were wool flannel, that wool flannel was so lightweight and breathable and nice, it was more comfortable than wearing the double knits. And the other thing that people don't know is cotton uniforms are only ever used once by the Kansas City Athletics on a vest. Cotton uniforms absorb and weigh you down when you get wet. Wool flannel uniform absorbs and wicks off and keeps you dry. So the wool flannel uniforms were more comfortable, but TV wanted double knits. They shone brighter on television, and so they were the real ruling party in the world of double knits.
Interesting. Was there a particular baseball jersey that you wanted to make that you just never got around to making?
That's a good question. Nobody's ever asked me that. Is there anything that I wanted to make that I never got around to making? I honestly can't. I made too many. I can't think of any. I wish I. No.
During your time at Mitchell & Ness, which 3 jerseys were your all-time best sellers? Do you remember?
Well, the Sammy Baugh jersey.
Yeah.
The Lance Allworth jersey.
Yeah.
In football. I would have to say in basketball, Julius Erving was a huge hit, local. In baseball, it was really Mickey Mantle was number 1. Number 2 was probably Jackie Robinson. Number 3 was Hank Aaron. Stan Musial's right up there as number 4. Very, very high. Willie Mays is right in that mix. They would be the top 5 or 6 guys.
Yeah.
I dealt a lot with Willie. Willie was a great guy, smart businessman. He used to say to me, "Peter, nobody wants to buy these goddamn wool jerseys. Can't you make my jerseys in double knits?" I said, "The only double knit you ever wore was the Mets, and nobody wants that." So no, he was a sharp guy, as was Stan Musial. And I knew Mantle because I made all of the uniforms for Mickey Mantle's restaurant on 42 Central Park South in New York.
Been there, yeah.
And I was at the bar with him one night, and I said, "Mickey, when did you know you were going to be good?" He says, "I was very insecure until I started hitting major league pitching in my first spring training." He said, "And then I had a sense that I could really be good when I was confident I could hit major league pitching." I thought that was a very honest answer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, he was a very nice man.
Other than the Sammy Baugh jersey that you made, were there any jerseys that you kind of just did as a pet project because you liked the athlete and you didn't think they'd be big sellers, but they ended up being big sellers? Obviously not to the level that
No.
Sammy's jersey was, but...
Well, Hugh McElhenney. I like to make Hugh McElhenney. I like to make Gale Sayers. I love to make Ditka and Butkus jerseys. I love making Ron Jaworski's jerseys. I just made the jerseys of people that I love. Tommy McDonald is my all-time favorite player because we were the same size. So, I can't think of anything that was so off the wall that I knew it wouldn't sell, but I just wanted to make. Mm-hmm. The thing that happens is everything I made sold. I mean, I was
it's a good problem to have.
Yeah, I mean, it was shocking to me, I would come out with a Dan Fouts jersey and it would just sell. Mm-hmm. And
but I think you had the eye for the uniform just looked cool.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't matter who the player is at that point. It's just, does this look cool? Is it bright colors? Are the lightning bolts on the shoulder patches? I mean, does it look cool? And if it does, the name is irrelevant.
Well, I didn't think that way. But a lot of people did.
Yeah.
More people than I knew of.
Yeah.
I wasn't thinking about the colorness or coolness of it. Like I like to make Steve Bartkowski because I liked Atlanta Falcons.
Yeah.
Billy White Shoes Johnson because he was from Widener, local guy. I like to make him. Oh, I'll tell you a funny story because of Howie Long. One year we were at the Super Bowl in Houston and Howie Long, Boomer Esiason, and Phil Simms were in this sort of private cocktail party that we were invited to by an organization that represents them. And I was making their jerseys and selling tons of them. So I went up to them and I said, guys, I'm Peter Capolino. I'm Mitchell and Ness. I make your jersey. And it was either Howie Long or Boomer said, well, we don't want to meet you. And I said, really? So one of them takes a royalty check out of their wallet and says, who's this Fran Dietrich that signs all of our checks? That's my wife. We want to meet her. And she's over in the corner. Now, my wife is an artist, and she doesn't particularly like sports. Mm-hmm. So she's mortified. So she comes over, and they surround her. And they're big guys,
yeah.
All three of them. And they're giving her hugs. True story.
That's funny.
They don't want to meet me. Who are you?
Yeah, you just design them. Who pays us?
Who's this Rand Dietrich that signs our checks?
I love that he just had one in his wallet.
Yes, I know.
You mentioned earlier how some jerseys would go out of production for you guys. How would you decide when that would happen and when a particular uniform would stop being made? Because for lack of a better word, you do retire jerseys, or at least you'd put them on hiatus sometimes. So how would you determine when that would happen?
I think in the beginning, it would happen in the flannels if I was just out of wool flannel.
Okay,
so
fair enough.
It's not exactly what you would call scientific, deciding not to make anymore. As we got bigger and we had sales reps all over the country, we were at our height, we were selling to about 1,000 stores in the United States. So we would attempt to pre-book orders a little bit. Mm-hmm. One of my downfalls was I didn't do enough pre-booking. I don't know if you understand what pre-booking means, mm-hmm. but what it means is you don't make a jersey unless you get a certain amount of advance orders.
Right.
I would just make the jersey and then think it'll sell. Sometimes I made the jersey and it didn't sell. So that would stop me.
Yeah.
And then later on, as we got more sophisticated, if we didn't get orders for it or any demand from the sales reps around the country, that would stop me.
And so how would you decide what stores, like if there's a store in Chicago, would they only get Bears, Bulls, White Sox, Cubs?
No, they get anything. But what I did do is I didn't want to have too many stores that were adjacent or close to each other competing to sell the exact same product. So that was a challenge because so many retailers wanted to carry our product. I had to name which retailers we would buy. So I offended some retailers who were very respectable and good retailers because their main competition was my customer. Mm-hmm. And I didn't want to sell to my customer's main direct competition. That was always a challenge. And after a while, it fell on my sales reps to decide who was going to carry the Mitchell & Ness product line.
Yeah. I've always kind of personally wondered why the 1917 White Sox uniforms were taken out of production. Was that Major League Baseball being afraid of the association with the 1919 Black Sox team, whose uniforms looked extremely similar? Like, did they ask you to stop making them? Because I feel like those uniforms would be big.
I have no memory of deciding not to make that uniform. The only uniform Major League Baseball ever stopped me from making was Pete Rose. After Bart Giamatti died, they sent me a letter and because Pete Rose was banned from baseball. But They have reversed that now.
Right.
And Mitchell & Ness is allowed to make Pete Rose. Now, I decided I wouldn't make any O.J. Simpsons. And one of the things you haven't asked me about at all here is the counterfeiting. The counterfeiting business was as big a volume as my real business. It doubled the size of Mitchell & Ness name. And O.J. called me one day. He didn't know my name. He just asked for the owner of Mitchell & Ness, and I got on, and he said, "This is O.J.," and I knew it was him. He said, "I notice all the jerseys that I'm autographing have a Mitchell & Ness label in the neck. Do you owe me any royalty money?" And I said, "No, Mr. Simpson, I've never made your jersey. Those are all counterfeit jerseys that are bootleg jerseys coming from Korea or China or anywhere, and I've never made any of your jerseys." And he thanked me and he hung up. Now, I do remember the NFL, because O.J. was found not guilty, they continued to invite him to every Super Bowl, every event that Hall of Famers get invited to, and they couldn't tell me not to make the O.J. jersey legally, but I just didn't do it. But USC, as I recall, put out a dictate of not making any O.J. jerseys.
Interesting.
That was just a recollection. I'm not sure if that's factual or not.
You said the counterfeit industry doubled the Mitchell & Ness. What do you mean by that? Just
when I was doing $40 million a year, they were doing $40 million a year in counterfeit Mitchell & Ness jerseys.
Gotcha. So your label is out there twice as much.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah.
All over the place. In fact, one year, the Department of Commerce was putting out the 10 most counterfeited labels in the country, and I was in the top 10.
Wow.
With Nike and Adidas and Ralph Lauren, and here's this little schmo company. They do more business in one day than I do in a year, and I was in the top 10 of the most counterfeited labels in America.
Do you think that helped your business?
Do I think it helped my business? You know, it's a good question. I never evaluated it that way the entire time. It was so annoying. I was spending in excess of $500,000 a year in trying to slow down the counterfeiting. The leagues were trying, but they were very unsuccessful. Do I think it helped my business? I think it helped in the awareness of the name Mitchell & Ness.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You're double the visibility.
Double the visibility.
Yeah.
Yep.
So you struck a deal for the exclusive rights to reproduce Michael Jordan's jerseys. How did that come about?
Well, at the time, it started out with Upper Deck and Upper Deck Authenticated. And at the time, it was either Reebok or Adidas was doing the NBA. And Nike didn't have any NBA rights. But everybody needed Michael Jordan jerseys. I had the NBA rights, and I wasn't a threat to Nike. So I went to Jordan and the Jordan brand and to Nike and said, I want to make Michael Jordan jerseys because they would not let Reebok or Adidas make them. That would be,
Right.
They'd burn in hell before they would do that.
Right.
But this little company, Mitchell & Ness, how much can that hurt us? And Jordan needs jerseys.
Right.
So that's how it all came about.
During your pitch meeting, were you saying, I want to make your rookie jersey. I want to make the 91-92 jersey.
I had a whole list.
Yeah.
Everything, yeah. I even made his all-star jerseys.
Right.
And I made that limited edition jersey and the white shoe leather. I lined the box with the same leather that was on his Jordan shoe. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you ever talk to him directly, or was it all just through his people?
All through his people.
Yeah.
I only talked to him once when he wanted his credit for his kids.
Tell me about that.
He wanted a $5,000 credit because all his kids wanted Mitchell & Ness stuff. I said, sure.
When you were talking with his representatives, were there uniforms that they specifically wanted made, or did they say, like, we want this jersey made first?
No, that it was Upper Deck Authenticated that started with what they wanted.
Interesting.
And then I just expanded it.
What were the ones that they asked for first?
I hate to keep saying this, but I can't
That's
remember.
okay. Yeah.
There was so many.
You've done thousands of uniforms. I don't expect you to remember every single one. If you could pinpoint 3 specific moments in Mitchell & Ness's history that you would classify as turning points, what would those 3 moments be?
The first turning point was when the 2 people brought in their jerseys to be repaired.
Do you remember who those 2 people were?
Nope.
Do you think that they know
Nope.
their business launched what you did?
No, I'm sure they have no idea.
Interesting, yeah.
Nope. That was one turning point. The next turning point was when Sports Illustrated did the baseball story on me in July of 1987.
Yeah.
That was a really big turning point.
Do you still have copies of that
Oh, yeah.
issue? Yeah, cool.
And then the next turning point was when I got my NBA license. That was a very, very big thing. And then from there, The NFL asked me to recreate their history just the way I had done for everybody else, and then the NHL. We haven't talked much about the NHL, but Dave the Hammer Schultz is a famous player for the Philadelphia Flyers, and he and I forget Tiger's last name, hold the record for the most penalty minutes. But Dave was a good player, and the Flyers won the Stanley Cup in 2 years in a row.
The Broad Street Bullies,
The
right?
Broad Street Bullies.
Yeah.
And I hired Dave's son, Brett, to work for me. And when I got the hockey license, I said, Brett, have your dad bring in one of his jerseys. I mean, that's the easiest way to reproduce it without going through hoops.
Absolutely.
So Dave comes in, and I meet Dave Schultz, and he brings this jersey in, and he shows it to me, and it's all full of dried blood. And I go, oh my God, Dave, what happened to you? And he looks at it and he goes, well, none of it's my blood. And that's how I met Dave Schultz.
Amazing. What a perfect answer.
It's perfect.
What happened to me? Nothing.
Nothing.
So in late 2007, you sold Mitchell and Ness to Adidas, but you ended up staying on for about 4 more years. Was that a contingency of the sale, that your original vision would continue to be carried out and not be compromised?
No. Adidas has been resold. So Adidas owned Mitchell and Ness from 2008 for about 9 years. And then in 2016, they sold Mitchell and Ness. I think Adidas thought that the nostalgia craze and the headwear craze was starting to level off, and they sold Mitchell and Ness to another company called Juggernaut Ventures based in D.C. A guy named Kevin Wolf is now the CEO, and Mitchell and Ness grew even greater. I got it up to 40 million.
Wow.
Adidas got it up to about 109 million, and now Mitchell and Ness is at about 250 million. But the Adidas growth and the new growth, it's based on the brand name Mitchell & Ness, and it's based on the universal awareness that Mitchell & Ness is a historic crew brand. But it's really based today on more sportswear and activewear with a nostalgia flavor or nostalgia logo on it. There's not as much of the authentic side as there used to be. It's not based on the historic and vintage uniforms that I founded the company on. It's a little different, and it's broader based. And the current company has a lot of arms in South America, Asia, and Europe that I never had.
I was going to ask, do you think that that growth is sustainable? But if they went global with it as opposed to just in America, that probably accounts for a lot of the growth.
Yes, it does. It accounts for a tremendous amount of the growth.
Yeah.
But they still do the Jordan. You know, they're always coming out with more Jordan.
Yes, they are.
Yeah, and they're still going to do some flannels. But, you know, I'm a small business guy. Those kinds of numbers, I wouldn't be capable of managing a company that big, to be honest with you. I like more what Jerry Cohen is doing at Ebbetsfield Flannels.
Yeah.
You know. And my sweaters. You haven't asked me anything about my sweaters.
So I want to.
I shouldn't be talking about my sweaters. They'll come and get me. Except so many people at MLB have my sweaters, big co-conspirators. But I only make one every other month. It's not. Oh, I'll tell you one funny story. When I first sold the company to Adidas, the sweaters I make are $500, $700, $800 sweaters.
Yeah.
And they're made by a little old woman in Manson, Maine named Norma Reichert. And Adidas liked the idea that I had such high prestige products. So they said, well, put Norma on a conference call. I said, okay. So we called Norma. And when she's not bowling is when she makes sweaters for me. So I put Norma on, and these executives from Adidas go, Norma, these sweaters you make are amazing. Do you think you could increase your production for us? And she goes, sure. And then they go, well, how many a month do you think you can produce? And she says, maybe 3.
You asked for an increase. That's an increase.
That's an increase. That's tripling my business. So to this day, Norma makes about 1 sweater every other month for me. For some people who are serious collectors, some people who are executives with Major League Baseball teams, some people that work for Major League Baseball, I'm not naming any names, and some people who just love the sweaters and enjoy them. And they're extremely accurate. Some of the most accurate things that I have ever made. And thank God for the Levy Group, who still, you know, I just finished a 1923 Philadelphia Athletic sweater and a 1911-12 Cubs sweater, and a 1910-11 Brooklyn Super Boss or Dodgers
Yes.
sweater for people. Oh, I'm just finishing up on a 1925 Babe Ruth Yankee sweater. Major League Baseball sweaters ended in 1930.
Right.
The last person I ever saw one in was Lou Gehrig in spring training of 1930 with the word Yankees going across the front, and then that was the end of them.
Do you think that there's a space for those to be brought back?
Jerry Cohen got the rights at Ebbets Field Flannels. He's going to make them. They're going to be priced at around $400, which would be a much more feasible price than the $700-800 that I charge for Norma Hand making me single ones.
Yeah.
So he will have the rights, and I believe Ebbets Field next baseball season will come out with the sweaters.
Cool.
And him and me together working on those sweaters, they will be very accurate.
That's incredible. Yeah. You were inducted into the Sporting Goods Industry Hall of Fame as a member of the class of 2020. What does an honor like that mean to you?
It was shocking. You know, I went in with the founder of Skechers, a $4.5 billion company, and me, a $40 million company. And I got a standing ovation.
But
it
you
was
could
so
argue
nice.
that, forget the dollar amounts, your impact has been as big as anybody.
I guess so, yeah.
You changed the culture.
I did, but I don't think of myself as that important, to be honest with you. I think of myself as doing something to survive, and then after doing something to survive, I could make enough money to retire and enjoy a lifestyle that I like, which is a relatively simple lifestyle. You know, I was shocked, to be honest with you, and it was a wonderful honor. A lot of my peers, the whole sporting goods industry was there. It was a big event in Naples, Florida. I got up to speak, and there's Joe Theismann, and he says, "Peter, I need jerseys. I need more jerseys." I said, "Joe, I'm not in charge of that anymore. I can't do anything. Where are my jerseys?" So, but it made me feel good, and it made me feel that I accomplished more than I realized.
Absolutely. Was there a point where you did start thinking about the legacy that you were going to leave behind?
No, I didn't start thinking about that. I just thought about what I did and thought about what I loved. I made a lot of friends. I enjoyed it. You know, my legacy to me is really not all these jerseys and the history of baseball and everything. My legacy to me is all the nice young employees that I've had from 1970 through 2008 that have gone on to do bigger and better things. And they've stayed friends. We're like family and a network. My doctor, his kids work for me. My doctor's associate doctor worked for me. My accountant worked for me. My financial advisor worked for me. People who have gone on to do very prestigious things in this country have all worked for me for periods of time. And that's where I feel my legacy is with all those nice young people who came through Mitchell & Ness and remained linked all these years. That's the thing I feel more proud about than anything else, to be honest with you.
Were there ever points in your career where you were asked to compromise your integrity in some way?
Compromise my integrity? Well, I think when... No, the only thing that I do remember doing that I think I failed at one year, and it was just before I was being bought by Adidas, Major League Baseball wanted me to make a lower price point item because they had so much demand and so many people so irritated that I wouldn't sell to them. Like, do you know the big chain Models?
Yeah.
You know, I liked Michael Modell and those guys, but I wouldn't sell to them because they were not my... But because Modell's was so big, NFL and MLB and the NBA, they would get angry at me. So one year, I tried to make a cotton twill version of my Authentics, and they were miserable and failed. You know, I fell to a little bit of pressure from MLB asking me to do that, and then I did try it, and it didn't work out. That's about the only thing I can think of.
Did your legacy ever, as you were still working, did it ever influence any of the decisions you made about things you would do or things you wouldn't do because you realized at a certain point that you were bigger than just a sporting goods company? The things that Mitchell and Ness were doing were bigger than just selling shirts?
I have to be honest with you. I was a businessman. What I was doing was just a sale. The legacy and romance that's attached to it is coming from the outside in. I was a businessman, and I needed to pay my bills. I made what I loved. I made them, and they sold. I enjoyed the reaction of people. And what I did not realize was the impact I had in sports society as a whole. I did not realize that. And it comes at me via Facebook and Instagram every day. It comes at me from people like yourself every day. I am a little bit unaware and blindsided by the romantic sports impact I have had on the landscape of American sports. It was not my intent or goal. It just happened, and I'm proud that I did it the right way.
Yeah.
That's about all I can say.
Yeah. Do you have any of the old Mitchell and Ness uniforms that you made, or do you collect authentic, like the actual game-worn uniforms? Do you have a collection of your own?
Nothing.
Nothing. Interesting. Well, why?
I have sweaters.
Okay.
I have sweaters.
That's surprising to me.
I know it's surprising to everybody.
Yeah.
You know, the one regret that I do have is that I wish I had kept one piece of everything I made. If you include all 4 legs and the jackets and everything, it would probably be about 18 to 20,000 items. And if I had one piece of everything I've ever made, I've always thought it would be nice to have an art display or a museum display.
Yeah.
But I didn't. And it's only a minor regret, you know, because there's almost one piece of everything I made out there.
Right.
And they're turning up stuff I don't even remember making.
Maybe you didn't make them. Maybe they're counterfeit.
No, I can tell the difference. I remember a guy sending me a Cincinnati Reds from the '89 All-Star game, pictures of it. You know, now what I remember about that 1989 Cincinnati Reds was in 1989 I was in Cincinnati with Fran. It was our first All-Star game, and I had lunch and sat next to Mark McGuire, who wasn't as big in 1989 as he is today. And then I remember in the Cincinnatian hotel, Billy Martin was drunk in the middle of the game, watching it on TV with his head on the bar and asking me, who's winning? Like, what have I got myself into? So they sent images of a 1989 Cincinnati Reds jersey with the '89 All-Star patch on it. And I'm going, oh, I made that? I forgot.
If you could go back and keep one piece, somebody walks in and says, you know what, Peter, I did keep one of everything, and I'm going to let you pick out which one you're going to have. What one would you want?
I think I would want, and it would be a jacket. It wouldn't be a jersey.
Interesting.
Yeah, it would be a jacket. And if I was going to keep one of anything, it would probably be a 1950 Phillies jacket.
Why is that?
Because of Jamie Lee Curtis.
Not what I was expecting that answer to be. Go ahead.
Her husband is Christopher Guest, and she would call to get a 1950 Phillies jacket for Christopher Guest. And Fran would call down and wanted to talk to me on the phone. I said, I'm having phone sex with Jamie Lee Curtis. I can't talk to you right now. So I didn't know Guest was such a Phillies fan, but it was also a beautiful jacket. I'm joking about the jacket. It's hard for me. Now, you won't believe this, but it's hard for me to be attached to them the way the customers are attached to them, my own personal self. I'm attached to the 1960 Eagles. I'm attached to the 1950 Phillies. Well,
the ones that were part of your childhood and your memories.
Right, and those are the ones that I'm attached to. The others I like, and I enjoy, I loved making them, but I didn't have any strong attachment to collecting.
But did you understand while you were making them that other people would have an attachment to them?
Sure, that's why I made them.
Of course.
Yeah. What was your favorite team growing up?
I grew up in Chicago in the 90s, so
I'm
a Michael Jordan
You're
fan.
a Michael Jordan guy.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not in love with Jordan or his jerseys, but you are.
I am.
And you deserve to be. You know, I'm in love with Wilt Chamberlain, and I'm in love with guys like Paul Arizin and Tom Gola,
right.
And in love with Irving and Barkley and Iverson and all of that crowd. And those where my attachments are. People call, like Billy Crystal.
Yeah.
He would call and get stuff for his friend Rob Reiner, and I insulted Rob Reiner one time because Billy Crystal wanted to buy him a 52 jacket in the New York Giants. I said, I think it's got to be bigger. And he says, you saying my friend Rob is fat? And I'm saying, he's bigger than a 52.
Yeah.
Oh, I would get all kinds of calls. I had a lot of fun with Spike Lee over the years, too.
Right.
I got to know Spike and made a lot of stuff that he wore while he was directing and while he was in movies, too. And so that was a nice relationship.
You've been around for some pretty great moments in Philadelphia sports history. What is your favorite Philadelphia sports memory?
Probably when the Eagles won the championship game. I was there.
The championship game in 1960, not the Super Bowl.
No, the championship game in 60. I was there. I was 15 years old, sitting in the upper deck end zone where Tommy McDonald caught the touchdown pass, and right where Jim Brown was finally tackled by Chuck Bednarik. Sitting there, it was December 26th, the day after Christmas. They cleared the field of snow, and I was at that game. In fact, I have been to every single Philadelphia Eagles game from 1956 to 1970.
Wow.
But the 1961, you're 15 years old, you put the face masks on the helmets,
right.
You knew McDonald and Bednarik and Van Brocklin, and you knew everybody because you've been in the locker rooms, as a kid, and at all the training camps in Hershey.
Yeah. And your dad's company was putting the uniforms on them.
Putting the uniforms on them.
You had a legitimate connection to that team.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's pretty special.
Yeah.
What's next for you?
Well, I'll be 77 on January 12th. I continue to make sweaters with Norma for people that want these custom sweaters. They're even going to get more expensive, wool yarn. It's all domestic. It's a beautiful business. I like doing that. I'll informally continue working with Jerry Cohen at Ebbets if he needs me for anything. Mm-hmm. I have to tell you that Jerry Cohen is, in the scheme of things, an even better researcher than me. He is amazing in his research and development that he does, and he does it more single-handedly than I did it. I had a staff and a team. My company is a lot bigger than Jerry's. I do consulting with a company called Team Pro Standard, and Team Pro Standard makes headwear and apparel for the leagues, and I'm on their consulting board in their relationships with the NBA, the NFL, and Major League Baseball. And so those things keep me alert and busy.
I think it's also easier to do research today, not to knock...
Oh, let me tell you a research story.
Yeah.
I used to do research in the 80s about all the players who played for the NFL, the NBA, and MLB. So if a guy played for two of those three, who were all those guys? Mm-hmm. I came up with a list of 19 or 20 guys, even from like Otto Graham.
Yeah.
He played professional basketball in 45 before the Cleveland Browns in 46. I lost the list, and I had spent years, because you'd have to go through encyclopedias and books and magazines, and each league had their libraries, and I was so proud of this list. And I had a young 25-year-old assistant at the time, and I was telling her, I said, man, I can't find this list. And she says, well, let me help you. It took her like 45 seconds to Google it, and it came up, and it was like, are you kidding me?
Right.
Are you kidding me? I couldn't believe it.
The internet and the digitization of records has changed research and history, and it's just so different today.
One of the things that I like about sweaters is you can't find a lot about it.
Right.
There is guys out there who do a lot of sweater research and bring me some sweater history and images that I've never seen, but I have a lot that they've never seen and that are not on the internet.
Right.
And you can't Google. I was Googling Joe Jackson. He played for the Athletics in 08 and 09, so I know what he would have worn, but there's no images of him in it.
Right.
And then I make the 1917 and 1919 White Sox sweater, too, but there's no images. The only image I've ever seen of Joe Jackson is in a sweater that's a shady image of a minor league team.
Right, the Savannah Indians. There's also one more of him from the profile, so you don't see the front of him shivering in Comiskey Park.
Yes.
So, yeah.
He's a tough one. You come up with it, you let me know.
I would love to.
Yeah, I've looked.
Constantly trying to find images of him. Is there anything that we didn't touch on that you want to talk about? Or
I don't think so. I think you've hit on my whole career from the beginning to the end.
Cool.
I'll just say that I believe my friend Jerry Cohen at Ebbetsfield Flannels is continuing the tradition that I started, and I'll be wonderful to see him succeed.
Well, thank you very much. How can people reach out to you and keep up with what you're doing if they want to do that? Are you on social media at all?
Sure. Oh, yeah. I have thousands of friends on Facebook.
Cool.
In fact, there's 1,400,000,000 Facebook users. I'm the only Peter Capolino.
All right.
There's no others.
That'll make it easier for people to find you.
Anybody wants to have to put up with my food, my wine, my cats, And I post the sweaters that I make for people and images, and not as much sports as you would think.
But still a fun follow. We're friends on Facebook. It's
No,
always interesting.
You've seen some of it.
Yeah.
You see my stoop sits with all the dogs we feed every night.
Love it. Some of my favorite posts.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much for your time. I can't tell you how much it meant to be able to talk to you about this kind of stuff. I have dozens of your products in my house and have for years. So this was a real thrill. Thank you very much.
I have a Chicago Bulls hat for you before you leave.
All right. Thank you very much.
Okay.
And now it's time for a segment called What'd You Think, Mom?, where we talk to my mom who just listened to the interview with me and we ask her what she thinks. This is my real, actual mom. Her name is Lori, but I've always just called her Mom. Can you say something to prove that you are my mom?
Well, as the saying goes, I'm not only someone involved in the Mitchell and Ness podcast, I'm also a customer.
A longtime customer.
A longtime customer, from framing your non-Mitchell and Ness little Michael Jordan jersey, the first one you ever had, from the time that you were about a year old. You would wear it more like an evening gown when you went to sleep because it was on you all the time, to then graduating up to Mitchell and Ness jerseys and buying multiple jerseys for you for birthdays, holidays, and watching your uniform collection grow into something, as in, oh, it's something.
Yeah, thank you to Stephen Dilger for setting this interview up in the first place. Stephen is a friend of mine through playing in the vintage baseball games, but he's originally from Philadelphia, and he's friends with Peter in real life. So Stephen listened to a couple episodes of the podcast and said, you absolutely have to get in touch with Peter. And I was like, cool, give me his phone number. I would love to talk to Peter Capolino, whether it's for the podcast or not, because I love this stuff.
Right.
You know, you use the phrase kindred spirits all the time.
Exactly.
Peter and I, if we were the same age and lived in the same city, we would have sleepovers to this day, I'm sure.
That is what I was thinking of saying, and I'm like, okay, I'm overusing it, but honest to God, right?
So Stephen put us in touch, and I reached out to Peter via email, but he didn't know who I was,
right?
And we weren't speaking face to face. He'd never seen a picture of me. Even when we're talking on the phone, I'm just introduced as one of Stephen's buddies, so he probably thinks, okay, I'm around the same age. And we're talking about some high-level stuff. And so it's just like, okay, this is an older dude who's an expert on the subject and knows his stuff. And so he's like, yeah, do you want to, come do the interview at my house in Philadelphia? I was like, yes, I do. What, should I bring a bottle of wine?
You hear the doorbell? That's me.
And so he opens the door, and you could see he was taken aback by like, oh, I've been talking to a child this whole time.
Little does he know you're wise beyond your years.
Yeah, but he didn't think that that's who he was talking to.
You did not match the emails.
And so the first 20 minutes or so of the interview, I'm asking detailed questions, but could be anybody who just done research online for a Peter Capolino or a Mitchell and Ness based interview. So I hadn't proven anything to him. All I did was show up. So we're talking about the St. Louis Cardinals uniforms, and I acknowledged that I knew what he was talking about, and I don't think he really believed me. I think he thought I was just yeah-ing him.
Right.
And then he's like, all right, kid, you think you know your stuff, huh? And then he asked the question about the baseball centennial patch, which coincidentally, Todd Radom wrote an article on April 2nd, 2014. That's on his website. We'll throw it in the liner notes, specifically about that patch. And over the course of doing my own weird research over the years for who knows what reason, I came across Todd's article and cataloged that in my brain. So like, okay, now that's something I know.
Right.
And thanks to Todd's article, which I've always remembered, when Peter asked me that question, I knew the answer.
Right.
And could just rattle it off. And that is when Peter knew I wasn't just some kid who had done a bunch of research for this interview. I actually knew my stuff. And it's not like he hadn't already been warm and welcoming to me up until that point. I mean, we were 40 minutes into an in-person interview, and I was sitting at his kitchen table because he invited me to his house. But at that moment, he realized he could actually really talk high-level stuff and that I would get it. So all that to say, what did you think of the Peter Capolino interview?
I did recognize that moment as well. I wrote boom in my notes here. To me, this interview was my vindication. because early on he said his one regret was that he didn't keep everything. You know where this is going. Sorry, it's going to fall on you, my friend. When they were modernizing the facilities over the course of time, when he owned the company, and he goes into the warehouse and he goes, what are we going to do with this stuff? We don't need this old stuff. We don't need these old jerseys. We don't need this old equipment. And he purges. Later on, he wished he still had all those things. My life is good because I keep every single thing.
Yeah. How many 1954 New York Giants game-worn uniforms have you had the opportunity to maybe throw away?
Well, yeah, but, nonetheless, unlike the Levy Company, where he talks about when he first gets involved with them, and they have every sketch, every color pattern, every single thing. I'm sure that was another moment where he's thinking, yeah, why didn't I do that? Tell me again. But really, that was what I was thinking when he said that.
But to his point, when you're doing this stuff, you don't think of it as this is going to be remembered one day as historical. I'm just trying to make a shirt to keep my business afloat.
Right.
Now here we are 40 years later from when he started, and it's like, oh, that would have been a really cool piece of history.
Absolutely. I totally get that because to me, every piece of artwork that you generated, grades 1 through 8, is important. That's aisle 7 upstairs in the attic. But with what he was doing, at first, right, he wasn't doing the nostalgia stuff. But as soon as he starts doing the nostalgia stuff, even if he has that in his mind to be doing that kind of stuff, and even when he's doing different jerseys, the first ones he decides to do are his favorite guys, so when you have something like that inside of you, it's there from an early age. And so you would think he would be attached to the historic side, even for the remembrance of his dad being part of it and knowing the history of his dad and coming over and having it be his start in a new country. And for me, that's important to what I hold on to. It's because it is the story of a familial relationship. So it was just surprising that he was a purger, though if you don't have space, you don't have space, and the business is money for space.
I thought it was interesting that he referred to them as Mr. Mitchell and Mr. Ness after all these years.
Right.
It's still showing that respect. And
that 12-year-old kid who's pushing the 3-wheel cart. Another thing I believe in is things happen for a reason. And, you asked him 3 turning points, but before that, he was giving a description of how things happened. And one of the things he talked about was things were going bad. And there was a small tennis shop up for sale in Newtown, Pennsylvania. And he decided to put up his house for sale, thinking he can sell the house, use the proceeds, buy the tennis shop. His life will be golden because he's really a tennis guy all this time. And the house doesn't sell. Okay, so that's things happen for a reason, number 1. Number 2, the 1.6 million magazines sitting above his head. And he needs to go up there because things are going down the toilet. He's got creditors calling him. And so he goes there as an escape. And the things he's looking at, following that passion he has from the time he's a kid putting together the scrapbooks, he's still drawn to that stuff. And it informs him literally to take the next step further down the road. Okay, that's number 2. And number 3, one of his roles as an employee of Mitchell & Ness is going up and writing up all the stats on the recruits and doing the specs and learning how to make and sell uniforms. So you put all that stuff together, and those are 3 key things that things happen for a reason in his life and got him to where he was.
Yeah, we talked in the Jacob Pomrenke interview about how sometimes you're doing research and you don't even realize you're trying to write one story right now, but the research that you're doing to write that story isn't applicable to the story you're writing, but you are going to use it at some point.
Right.
And it becomes valuable, and it's what Peter was doing. Looking through those magazines, making those scrapbooks. He's just cataloging this information in his brain and knowing that, like, okay, the 1950 Philadelphia Phillies jacket has pinstriping here,
exactly.
Has this type of collar, or the shade of navy on this uniform is slightly darker than it was 2 years earlier. And is he taking notes? Probably not.
Right.
But just the same thing with me in the Todd Radom article. I didn't take notes on that. I just read it and remembered it. And okay, now next time it comes up, I remember, oh yeah, okay, their faces are angled differently.
Right.
And that's how things work. If you're a researcher, you've got to remember the stuff that you're researching. Otherwise, what's the point?
Exactly. And it's not even sometimes I got to remember it. Sometimes it's like you just do, and it's like, oh, you're carrying all this stuff around in your head. Oh my God, it gets difficult sometimes, doesn't it? It's a burden to bear, my friends, I'm telling you.
You can't remember what you had for lunch this afternoon, but you still remember all the words to Mambo number 5 for some reason.
Oh He said he considers himself very lucky. I really agree with that statement. There aren't too many people who are able to take a research passion and turn it into such a successful venture and bring joy to so many people. What he got the most out of in his success was that he was making memories. You know, he talked about somebody who walked into the store and saw a Ted Williams jersey, and the person just stops in their tracks, looks at that, and then reaches back and pulls out their wallet and pulls out something from Ted Williams, shows it to Peter and says, I've been carrying this around since I've been 12 years old. What Peter said is you're tapping into the emotions of those memories, and you're giving those people such a feeling. That is what nostalgia is. But when you see it like that, when you see it manifested in a physical way, you see the physical change in someone's demeanor, and like almost entranced, they reach and show you the proof of how dedicated they are to that. That must be an amazing feeling.
Yeah, there's a famous story about Bob Costas, how since 1958, he's been carrying around in his wallet Topps Mickey Mantle card number 487 from the 1958 set. It's the All-Star card, and he has never gone a day without that card in his pocket since he got that card. And it's Bob Costas. You know,
Right. No, I know.
He's met presidents and prime ministers and people from all walks of life, the most famous people to walk the planet, but that stupid little piece of cardboard means the world to him. And
Right.
I'm sure he has had offers to buy a Gem Mint 10 pristine slabbed version of that card, but that card, even though it's monetarily worth way more, it's not worth anything more than what he already has.
Exactly. It's priceless.
Yeah.
When we tell these stories of what their attachments are to, what jerseys did he produce first? His favorite players. And when are they from? His youth. Just like you said, it doesn't matter if you're an internationally known sportscaster, the newspaper guy, anybody in any walk of life. You are what you were when, and when you are a child and you have a hero, that hero worship is with you the rest of your life. You know, look who you are. I'm talking to you about an MJ jersey when you are 2 years old, and it's still that, you know, and even though as an adult, your knowledge, your experience, your innocence is gone a little bit, you are more aware of what is fantasy, the grim reality, whatever. You still hold that one person that you idolized in your childhood. You hold a grain of that with you all through your life. And it might get tarnished over time, and it might look a little different from an adult angle, but it's still, the nugget of that is always going to be there.
Well, when I was 12 or 13 years old, or whenever I got my first AOL Instant Messenger screen name, and you're going through and trying to decide, okay, what's my online persona going to be? First, I tried Dan the Man, but it had been taken. And I was like, okay, well, Dan the MJ fan. And here I am 25 years later, and that's who I've been since that day.
Right.
That is my online persona and will always be. You know, Michael Jordan hasn't worn a basketball uniform in 20 years, and he's still who I want to be when I grow up.
I know.
You know?
Oh, yeah.
Why do you think I shave my head?
Oh.
Peter, at one point in the interview, said everybody needed Michael Jordan jerseys. And boy, no statement ever made on this podcast has resonated with me more than that one.
Yeah, preaching to the choir. Yeah.
But thinking of the old baseball uniforms and the wool flannel, I'm glad that he talked about this, because people would always come to the museum or see these old uniforms in the Baseball Hall of Fame or whatever and think, how could these guys have played in these uniforms? This is in the early 1900s, you know, up into the 1940s. All of these games were day games. There were no night games because there were no lights yet. They're not traveling by plane. They're traveling by train. Those trains don't have air conditioning. Imagine playing a doubleheader in those uniforms in St. Louis in August. And how gross and how exhausting. But for Peter to be like, no, they actually were comfortable because they wick the sweat away.
Yeah, that was mind-boggling to me, because I was one of those people who would look at it and go, oh my God.
Well, when you pick them up, they're heavy. I mean, there is a weight to them. And now you think, okay, well, what if it's lightly raining? It's got to be unbearable to wear these uniforms. So for maybe the most knowledgeable uniform expert on the planet to say, they're not that bad, actually. That was cool. I'm glad to have that insight.
Yeah. I'm going to guess that they still were pretty rank, though.
Yeah, they smelled gross. It's not like they got washed every day, necessarily.
That's why they took the team pictures before the games, because no one wanted to stand next to each other after the games.
Yeah.
There was one point when he has a couple guys come in who are collectors of vintage uniforms, and they bring him in, need repairs, and then he goes into his supplier and sees the 12,000 yards of wool flannel, and there we go. It's like the light bulb moment of putting those two things together, and then he's off to the races.
One of the reasons why I clarified what year he walked into that shop and what the last year was that teams wore wool flannel uniforms is because the guy whose warehouse he walked into had been storing that useless wool flannel now for over a decade at that point.
Yeah.
So it was beneficial for both of them. You know, of course I'll make you these uniforms if it's going to get 12,000 yards of wool flannel out of my warehouse space. Then, you know, it turns into Peter repairing the real uniforms and making the guy a replica that he can then wear or show his buddies.
Brilliant.
And then, hey, by the way, I'm also going to make 5 for myself so I can sell them.
Even more brilliant.
So he's making a little bit of money on the repair job, but now he also has product to sell, and word of mouth is going to start getting around that, hey, this little shop in Philadelphia is selling old uniforms. It's amazing. You need to go see them.
Right.
And now we're off to the races. And what Peter said was that July 1987 Sports Illustrated issue, it was the July 6th issue. The cover story is One Day in Baseball, where they kind of just go through what an average day in baseball is. And so there's a picture of the Wrigley Field scoreboard on the cover of that issue. And within that issue, they talk about Mitchell and Ness and talk about Peter. And that exposure is what really launched Mitchell and Ness at its early stage. You know, he thought that was really launching it back then. You know, if you compare that launch to the 1998 to 2002 explosion, it was nothing. But in 1987, that was his first, oh my gosh, we're onto something here.
So that article also brings him under the radar of MLB. So it launched another whole thing that way where they decide to sue him. And what does he do? He takes 40 jerseys and spreads them out in front of them, and this is what I do. And being MLB, who money is a thing for them, apparently, go, oh, that's what you do? Want a licensing agreement? We want a cut of that.
Yeah.
You have to. I mean, you don't shut that guy down. One hand is washing the other in that situation.
Yeah. Something I would have liked to have asked him at that stage, did Major League Baseball then at that point start assisting you in your research? And did the teams have things in their archives and that they could send you? And here's a version of the 1927 Yankees uniform. And here's a version of the 1919 White Sox uniform. I wonder if now that he was officially on board with Major League Baseball, if he got help from the teams or from the league itself to say, if we're going to do this, let's do this. I wish I would have had the foresight to ask him that if that question would have came to my brain at the time.
Yeah, but I would think the answer would be no, because he really talked about how he was able to decipher in black and white pictures, or, you know, how you get down to how do you distinguish color in something where there's no photograph period, or if there is, it's black and white, and, you know, so on.
But that's my point, is that if you can actually have an example of the artifact,
right,
it becomes easier to do that.
Right, but what I'm saying is if that was the case, I think he would have maybe said something. Because to me, not only the teams, but the Hall of Fame. When he said he had never actually been to the Hall of Fame, my head still hurts from slapping it, going, what?
Yeah, he lives so close in comparison. You know, we're from Chicago, and it's like, okay, to drive to Cooperstown or even fly to Syracuse and then drive to Cooperstown, like, it's a trek. But if you're already within a couple hours, you know, you'd think, just scoot up there one day, buddy.
Yeah.
This is what you do.
You and me, that's not a trek. That's a day trip. Let's go. But when you think of what the benefit would have been, it's still mind-boggling to me. And if you're communicating with them, but things seem to have worked out. So I'm over it, but it just struck me as odd. But when he was going through the process of describing how does he get to older jerseys where it is, how do you figure out colors when you're looking at a black and white photograph before you have the technology that we do now? And he mentioned the name of 2 researchers right away, and then a third one who were his research team. And one of them was U.S. Congressman Bill Lipinski from Chicago, who was a congressman for 20 years. And I'm thinking, Peter is communicating with this guy. Okay, I need this team. And Congressman Lipinski is going to the Chicago Public Library and going into, you know, the deep files and looking up the articles of 3 days of the newspapers to get the colors. First of all, that's a brilliant.
Yes.
You figure that out and you have the key. I didn't have any preconception about Congressman Lipinski. I just know the name. But now hearing that, I think, oh, okay, he's that guy. Cool.
But even the newspapers describing the colors still might not get you the perfect result because, there's the famous picture of Shoeless Joe Jackson standing next to Ty Cobb. Joe's holding 3 bats in his hand and Ty's looking down at his hands.
I may have seen that once or twice.
If you look in the newspaper, they would say the Detroit Tigers wearing their white home uniforms with navy blue trim. And if you look in the Cleveland newspapers, it would say Shoeless Joe Jackson wearing the Cleveland Naps uniform that's white with navy blue trim. But the navy blues weren't the same navy blue.
Yeah.
So the words can only get you so much. Sometimes
Right.
you need the artifacts, especially when there are colors that encompass multiple shades. There are lighter navy blues and darker navy blues. The forest green he talked about with the Brooklyn Dodgers uniforms that one year. Forest green doesn't always mean the exact same Pantone color. Like there's a wide variety that it could be. So even more reason that I would have thought he would have maybe gone to the Hall of Fame or tried to seek out these in-person actual artifacts.
Right.
But at the same time, he's running a business. And he said many times it was a staff of 2 people. It was me and Fran and maybe another person. Mm-hmm. You can't just take off and go on a research trip. You got to fulfill the orders and run the store and ship out orders. And so I get it. We talked about the old baseball sweaters many times in this interview. And you even heard Peter mention the 1909 Savannah Indian sweater that Shoeless Joe wore. But what you guys don't know is that after this interview, Peter and I really dove into the research to try to find the colors of that sweater. It's something I'd been working on for years, but just couldn't find it. After this interview, I drove to Savannah, Georgia, and got help doing some research from Nate Peterson of the Georgia Historical Society, looking through the old Savannah newspapers from the day before opening day, the day of opening day, and the day after opening day, thanks to Peter's suggestion, of the 1909 Savannah Indians baseball season. But none of those newspaper articles, and I looked through all of the different newspapers, none of them mentioned the color of the uniform. Luckily, Mike Miller found a Savannah pennant very shortly thereafter that confirmed what the colors were. It is what we thought. It was maroon. And through that discovery, Peter and I were able to recreate the Savannah Indian sweater. And we were able to make that sweater, which is now proudly displayed in my house. So thank you, Peter.
Yes, it's amazing.
But again, going back to me impressing him with what I actually know and that I truly am a collector and researcher, he would have never even offered to make me a sweater without me proving myself to him.
Right.
So the fact that I have that sweater means more to me than having the sweater. It's that I earned his trust to get the sweater in the first place. So very meaningful thing to have. One of the fun things about working on that project, though, was going back and forth with Norma and with Peter and trying to decide, okay, we know that the sweater is gray. What shade of gray works? What is the correct shade of gray? And first we started with kind of a lighter version, but then when we found out what the maroon was, and you hold the maroon up to the gray, and we realized, okay, in person, the contrast of those 2 colors is way greater than the contrast of the maroon and the gray in the photo.
Right.
So we've got to go darker. And now we need to pick out exactly what type of button we're using. Are we using ivory? Are we using bone? Are we using plastic? Well, if we really want to get accurate, they wouldn't have had plastic buttons back then.
Right.
So it's between the ivory and the bone, and we decided we're going bone. And even the font of the S on the sweater, it was a custom done thing. They didn't load that up into a PC and print it out. It was, I'm sure, hand cut, hand stitched, hand sewn, everything. And so the first iteration of us hand drawing that logo to match wasn't quite perfect. There were serifs in the fonts that we were getting there, but it wasn't perfect.
Right.
And so that whole process of going back and forth and deciding exactly what type of yarn and how thick and how heavy, that was very fun to do with Peter, because you're just sitting there imagining this is what you did to recreate your entire inventory.
Right.
And that research, I love that stuff.
When you talked to him at the end of the interview about what's next or what's going on now, and the first thing he said was, my sweaters. And he relayed a story where he had, over the course of early years, compiled a list of every player in MLB, NFL, and NBA through 1946, I think he said. And he lost it. And so he mentions that to a modern employee who's sitting in front of a PC, I'm assuming, but it might have been her phone. And she's like, sorry to hear that. Click, click, here.
Yeah.
And he's going, wait, I wasted how much of my life doing that? But in the next sentence, he said, that's what he likes about doing the sweaters, because the research he needs to do for the sweaters is still not on the internet.
Right.
He still is doing that deep dive And it's the hunt, the thrill of the hunt that every researcher has.
Yeah. Part of the reason why I think I remember the address of Joe's Savannah Valet Service dry cleaning business in Savannah is because I drove to Savannah and went through the city directories, the actual books, hours and hours of searching, hours of driving, hours of communicating with Nate at the Georgia Historical Society. And then when you finally find it, it's like, yes!
Absolutely.
But when you just look for something online, so much of that information that I've looked up a billion things.
Right.
And sometimes I remember it and sometimes I don't. But that information it's just fleeting. It means nothing to me because you're not thinking about the answer. It's there. And I think that's why Peter's recall is so great, is because the things he was looking for, he had to look for.
Right.
He couldn't just call
knowledge.
it up.
So not only is that sweater an awesome sweater, but when you were talking about different jerseys or whatever, or how it would take years to track down colors, and what was the hardest one, and he mentions the 1917 World Series White Sox uniform, which is a gorgeous uniform. It would be great to see that in person the way it was.
Well, if you go to the National Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York, they have a Ray Schalk 1917 World Series uniform.
One of the clean socks. Okay, now I need to go back and see that. It's been a long time.
Yeah.
When he started talking about that particular uniform, and he's like, the flag patch was hard because it had the waves in it and the 3-layer SOX. He had the recall of what were the complexities within that. And even seeing a recreation of it at the museum, I just never looked at it in the detailed eye that he does. And that was interesting because you don't even think about that. Words I was never expecting here from a 77-year-old man. Do you know DMC?
Yeah, he's got a pretty impressive Rolodex.
He was not a name dropper.
Right.
And he so easily could have been a name dropper. And it so wasn't that, which was very cool.
Yeah.
And I liked that he knew what their passion was and respected it, even if, it wasn't his thing. And when he was asked what kind of music does he like, and he says John Denver, John Davidson, which I'm sure some people who listen to rappers would probably have to look up, John Davidson, and Barry Manilow, it just made me laugh out loud. And then DMC says to him, I like John Denver too, but don't tell anybody.
Yeah.
Keep it on the down low.
Yeah, so Daryl, if you're listening to this episode, we're sorry for blowing your cover.
Yeah.
But if you want to sit down and talk with me about it, I'd be happy to. So reach out. It's shoelesspodcast@gmail.com. Happy to have you on another episode.
The other comment that kind of made me chuckle was Peter being interviewed by MTV because his product is out there all over the place thanks to the rappers. And he makes a comment that, he watches MTV, BET, VH1. He watches all three every night. And the interviewer is like, really? And he says, I don't listen to the music. I listen to it without the volume on. And it's like, yep, perfect.
Yeah, but like you said, he wasn't a name dropper, but some of the stories he was telling, you need to know who he's talking to for it to have an impact.
Right.
And to be rubbing shoulders with Allen Iverson. And,
and having the respect of these gentlemen, because in one of the comments he said, he knew that they trusted him and they would talk to him, and he became friends with so many of these guys, versus the distrust that they had from the way that they might have been manipulated by white media, white owners, white whatever. And somehow they knew he was a guy who shared a passion.
Well, I think the benefit of him not being a fan of their music when he's talking with rappers is that, I used to run a record label, so I've been lucky enough to be in rooms with some very famous musicians. And when you are across the room and just observing them, the people who come up saying, oh my God, I love you so much. The album you made in 1997 means so much to me. They say, oh, thank you so much. That's great. I appreciate it. And they sign an autograph, and that's the end of the conversation. And if you know that they're a Bulls fan, you go up to that person and say, so who's your favorite Bulls player growing up? Now you're friends. So I think that is the interaction that he was having with these guys. He didn't care about their music or their album sales or how many times their video was shown on MTV. He was talking to them as people. And when you become so famous, people stop talking to you like you're a person.
Right.
And when somebody finally does, you want that around. You connect with that, and you want to be open and honest with that type of person.
You want to be Daryl, not DMC.
Right. Exactly.
He talked about when Kobe was hitting the stride of fame, And the shop is in Philly. And Peter started making a Sixers jersey with the name Bryant on the back of it and the number 23. So he would have younger kids coming into the store as customers, and they would see that jersey, see the Bryant name on the back of it. And the Bryant they know is Kobe Bryant.
Who is from Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm. And the number 23, which to anyone that age is, of course, Michael Jordan.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going, oh, how cool is this? It's like, Jordan and Kobe on the same jersey. And he's going, they might as well have asked, oh, Paul McCartney was in another band before Wings? Because that's what was going on. It wasn't Kobe. It was his father who played for the Sixers in the late 70s. And that's whose jersey it actually was. And he wore number 23.
Yeah. Joe Jellybean Bryant.
Yeah. Kids, It's like, this is why you teach history, people.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, though, that right around that time, Mitchell and Ness is making throwback uniforms super popular, and the colleges weren't giving away licensing rights. Mm-hmm. You weren't able to really make a Michael Jordan North Carolina uniform. Later on, the Jordan brand got that license, mm-hmm. but people were becoming crazed about having a collection of their favorite player. I want every uniform that this guy ever wore. I have a big Michael Jordan one. And other players who are also that famous and have a ton of people who that is their favorite player, they want to collect the whole gamut as well. So the next logical step, if you can't make somebody's college uniform because you can't get the rights, well, you're going to make their high school uniform. So while Kobe didn't go to college, Kobe's Lower Merion High School number 33 uniform is probably the most famous high school uniform. And it all happened around this time. And so when I said later in the interview with Peter that he changed the culture, I mean, he literally, the way you see people dressing on the street today is in large part due to Mitchell and Ness mm-hmm. and the direction they were under while Peter owned it.
Right.
And it's really incredible to think that he's just some guy.
Right.
He just loved the Phillies and the Eagles, and his dad outfitted the team, and now here he is influencing rap culture.
Right. In all other parts of culture, too. The other day I was looking for an old photograph from our family photos, and so I'm going through the 90s and the 2000s, and I'm seeing you and your sister in jerseys. Of course, you always have one player's jersey, but mm-hmm. we weren't even going to a game. It was just life.
Right.
We're going...
It's what you wore to school.
Yeah.
It's what you wore to go hang out outside.
And it was unisex. It was multicultural. It was all over the place. Mm-hmm. That's his fingerprint.
Yeah, very cool to talk to somebody like that. Regardless of my own personal collections, it was extra cool for me because I've been waiting 20 years to ask some of these questions. Mm-hmm. And
right.
to finally have the chance to have them answered was pretty special.
Just the same way that you honor MJ in your ways with a screen name or different ways that you do, that is how the Sammy Baugh story kind of starts with him, right? So he decides whose jerseys is he going to produce first, and it's people he liked. So he starts with Sammy Baugh as a football player because that's the sport he really likes. He doesn't know so much about baseball per se. But
that was when he said that, he was being very humble. I
know it didn't jive because
when you think of in terms of who are the world experts on baseball history, I don't think he considers himself part of that group, which that is probably fair. But to the average person, Peter Capolino knows way more about baseball and baseball history.
Right. But I don't know, if you were involved in the conversation, you would be giving stats and everything on players.
Uh-huh.
He would be aware of players, of course, especially key players over the course of time. Mm-hmm. But he is more knowledgeable about what they're hanging up in their locker before and after the game.
Yeah, but he could name the stats for football. So I think that was his distinction, is that if he walked onto a Jeopardy set and one of the categories was football history, he'd be like, oh, I'm going to get all of these questions.
Right.
And if it were baseball history, he'd be like, I hope one of the other contestants isn't a baseball historian.
Yeah. So he's got this Sammy Baugh jersey, and Jay-Z wears it. And even just having him say, Jay-Z wears it during the Girls video or whatever. Mm-hmm. And, it plays 18 months every single day, 15 times a day. And it turns out to be the most successful jersey. And, this came up when he was talking about royalties going to the estate of Jackie Robinson. I never really thought about that the player or surviving families or whatever, the estate, are entitled to that as well, which is awesome.
Absolutely.
I love that. But in this case, Sammy Baugh is still alive, apparently, and he's getting these checks.
Peter?
And they're $2,000 to $5,000 a month. Oh, holy cow. And I don't know why you're sending them to me, but really, thanks a lot.
Mm-hmm.
It's more money than I've ever made in all my years in the NFL. And I just want to say thank you.
So in 2006, a 1950 Sammy Baugh contract sold at auction. He made $11,000 that season. And
Right.
so he retires in 52. So he's legend Sammy Baugh at this point already. Record-breaking offensive and defensive and special teams player Sammy Baugh making $11,000. And in 2006, he's getting royalty checks for $5,000 a month.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Very cool to be able to do that. I'm sure that felt great.
Oh, yeah.
Because he's still that kid inside who, in 1952, he's 7 years old, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the sweet spot for forming your hero worship, right?
Yeah.
And so he's like, you're a legend. No one's going to forget you, and never tells him exactly why he's getting these checks. And that was such a noble sentiment to see that. And I can only imagine how he felt to be able to give the gift of honor to one of his heroes. That just was a real cool story.
Mm-hmm.
How about the jerseys he loved making? He starts reeling off Chicago Bears players for a Philly guy. Sayers, Ditka, Butkus.
But you got to think from his formative years, if he's a huge football fan, they were a great team and with great players. Those were the best players in the league when he was paying the most attention to football.
Yeah, but that's surprising to me. Yeah, I know he's a football fan, but for a Philly kid, though I guess he was a teenager when they were really such a great team in Chicago, I thought it was kind of surprising that this Philly kid is naming off the Chicago Bears. So that was kind of cool.
But yeah, you got to think as a sports fan, your favorite players, of course, are going to be on your city's team, your local, whatever your favorite team is. Usually it's the local team, but sometimes not. But usually it's going to be, if you're from that city, that's your team. But then the other people that you root for and watch and pay attention to and get excited by are the best players in the league. And so, yeah, even though he's from Philadelphia and he's an Eagles fan, who's more exciting to watch in the late 1960s than Gale Sayers?
Right.
It makes sense. It's the same kind of thing as I'm from Chicago and I'm a Bulls fan, but at a certain point, I loved watching Vince Carter dunk. I loved watching Kobe Bryant. I had a Kobe jersey at a certain point. I wasn't a Lakers fan, but I loved him.
Mm-hmm. Talking about it would be great to have the actual artifact in hand.
Mm-hmm.
At one point, when he was talking about one of the 3 turning points for Mitchell and Ness, the third one was getting the NBA license. Soon after, the NFL followed and the NHL followed.
Mm-hmm.
When he gets the NHL licensing agreement, he has an employee who is the son of a hockey player from Philadelphia and says, have your dad just bring in a jersey and we can just recreate that.
Right.
Awesome. That's exactly what we're looking for. In comes dad with the jersey, and it's got blood all over it because the dad is Dave Schultz, who's the enforcer on the Flyers. And Peter says, what's with all the blood? And he says, well, it's not my blood.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. When you're recreating the jerseys, having it in hand is so much different because a picture of it, yeah, you can see the general patterns and you can see the colors and where the piping goes down this or the collar or the sleeves look like this. But having it in hand, you can see this is where the stitches are and this is where the fabric is cut to make these parts come together. It's got to be so much easier to have it in hand than to just be looking at pictures or reading newspaper descriptions.
Right. The final thing, I guess, would be talking about his legacy. It tells a lot about who he was. To him, his most important legacy is all the different people who came through those doors and worked for him, the nice young employees from 1970 to 2008, and how they went on and what their imprint on the world was and how they still are a family. Mm-hmm. And you can see, it's the same way he was able to form relationships with some customers that you wouldn't normally think that would be a match, but it was because he ultimately is a people person and is caring about giving people the thrill of that memory, bringing back fond, warm spots in their history. Mm-hmm. And you can only imagine what kind of employer he was, and having them be part of that gift to other people. Mm-hmm. The loyalty is there from the people that he mentored.
And not only that, but them wanting to continue to be a part of that family. Sometimes you work a job and it might be a stepping stone job, or you might be getting rich at this job, but you're going to jump someplace else and become something bigger. And you never think twice about your former boss because he was just some guy who was writing paychecks.
Right.
And as rich and powerful as you may become because of the things that you learn from that person, you were never friends with that person. he was just your boss. Mm-hmm. I don't get the impression that that's how people think of Peter Capolino.
Right.
Very fun to talk to him. Very grateful for Steven for putting us together and for Peter and Fran to invite me into their home. Just a wild thrill to talk to the guy who has probably cost me more money than any other person, but I wouldn't have it any other way.
Very cool.
Cool. Thanks, Mom.
Thanks, Dan.
Okay, so that's it. In the introduction of this episode, I mentioned how there are a handful of ways for you to follow the podcast online. In addition to liking, subscribing, and giving My Baseball History a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app, please make sure you're also following us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where we are at Shoeless Podcast on each platform. By following us there, you'll get some bonus content throughout the month, and you'll be able to interact with us to let us know what you think of the show. You can also sign up for Clearing the Bases, our email newsletter, by heading to shoelesspodcast.substack.com. We publish 2 newsletters a month, which allow us to talk about lots of things we don't normally talk about on the show. I'll use that space to talk about the podcast, of course, but I'll also use it to write about baseball road trips I go on, to publish research I do, and to speak on current events in baseball, all of which are things I don't really do in episodes of My Baseball History. Look for a new issue to be published on the 2nd Friday and the 4th Friday of every month. If you have questions about the podcast or research you'd like to contribute to a future newsletter, submit something through the contact form on our website or email us at shoelesspodcast@gmail.com. If you have ideas for guests you'd like us to talk to on the podcast, send us your list. If you know current or former baseball players, managers, broadcasters, or journalists who you can help us get in touch with, or if you are one, let's talk. During our interview, Peter mentioned Jerry Cohen of Ebbets Field Flannels a couple times. While Mitchell & Ness has turned into more of a streetwear brand after Peter's retirement, Ebbets Field Flannels seems to have grabbed the baton and kept going. Until the past couple years, they focused more on minor league teams, Negro League teams, college teams, and international teams, which are areas that Mitchell & Ness just never really explored. But Ebbets Field Flannels has also recently gotten licenses for Major League Baseball and the NFL, allowing them to create authentic jackets and sweaters which teams in each league wore dating all the way back to 1901. I don't have nearly as many pieces from them as I do from my decades of collecting Mitchell & Ness, but my most recent purchase from Ebbets Field Flannels was a 1948 Birmingham Black Barons road uniform with the number 8 on the back. The Black Barons played their home games that year at Rickwood Field, as they did every year from their inception in 1920 until they disbanded in 1960. During their 40 seasons, the Birmingham Black Barons won 4 league titles, 1943, 1944, 1948, and 1959. Rickwood Field is the oldest professional baseball park in the United States. It's older than Wrigley Field, which opened as Weigman Park of the Federal League in 1914. It's older than Fenway Park, which opened in 1912. Rickwood Field was originally built for the Birmingham Barons in 1910 by team owner Rick Woodward, hence the name. It was used for scenes in the Tommy Lee Jones movie Cobb, about Ty Cobb, and the Chadwick Boseman movie 42, about Jackie Robinson. Over 120 Hall of Famers have played on the field over the years, either as a member of a Birmingham team or as an opponent. Some of the Birmingham Black Barons who have been inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame include Mule Suttles, who played first base for the team in 1924 and 1925, Satchel Paige, who pitched for the team at various points from 1927 through 1930, Willie Wells, who was the team's shortstop in 1941, and Willie Mays, who played center field for the team in 1948 and 1949. 1948 was Willie Mays' first year in professional baseball. He was 16 years old when the season began, and 17 when he celebrated in the clubhouse at the end of the season after the team won the Negro American League Championship. He wouldn't graduate high school for 2 more years, at which point the New York Giants signed him to his first white major league contract. He joined the big league club and won Rookie of the Year in 1951, leading the Giants to the National League pennant over the Brooklyn Dodgers. But in 1948, he wasn't a polished baseball player yet. People saw lots of potential in him, especially in his abilities to run and throw, but Black Barons manager Piper Davis saw more. He helped Willie learn how to hit a curveball, and he gave him free rein in center field to catch any ball he could get to, once starting center fielder Norman Robinson broke his leg. Veteran left fielder Jim Zapp and veteran right fielder Ed Steele were reluctant to give up playing time to the young Mays at the beginning of the season, but since neither of them were especially known for their defensive range, by the end of the year when a ball was hit to the outfield, they would yell, "Come on, Willie!" Since Rickwood Field is still active, there's a good possibility that the number of Hall of Famers who have played on the field continues to increase, especially with the news Major League Baseball announced that on June 20th, 2024, the San Francisco Giants will be playing the St. Louis Cardinals at Rickwood in a regular season game which will act as a tribute to the Negro Leagues. Of course, the focus will be on Willie Mays, who is possibly the best player to play on any baseball field, let alone at Rickwood. I plan to be at that game, wearing my 1948 Birmingham Black Barons uniform with the number 8 on the back, the same number Willie wore that season. And in case you had any doubt, yes, I also got the matching hat. Don't forget, it's a huge help when you guys rate and review the show on whatever platform you choose to listen. 5-star ratings help our podcast get shown on more people's suggested podcast pages, which means more people will hear our show. It just takes a couple seconds of your time, but it really helps us a lot. And of course, liking us on social media, interacting with our posts, and sharing things with your friends is great too. No matter how you choose to support us, even if it's just by listening, we appreciate you being here. Until next time, I'm Dan Wallach, and this is My Baseball History.